Hey everyone! Before the story begins, if you haven't already subscribed, hit the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next moving and thrilling stories. Hit like if you love stories about justice and truth, and comment below with the name of the city or country you're watching. I want to know how far my story has traveled in this world. Now, let's dive into the story. The day my son looked me in the eye and told me I was getting nothing. Nothing from the woman I had spent 30 years of my life loving, building, and sacrificing for. I did not cry. I did not argue. I sat very still in that cold kitchen chair and watched his mouth move, and I thought to myself, he has no idea. He never did. None of them did. They saw an old woman with a quiet life and a small apartment, and they made their assumptions. What they forgot, what every single one of them forgot, was that I had been the one holding the foundation together while they were busy celebrating what sat on top of it. I want to tell you something that took me over 2 decades to understand. Being forgotten is not the same as being powerless. I know that now. But on the morning my son Nathan showed up at my door with that particular expression on his face, the one I had learned to recognize over years of small humiliations, I did not feel powerful. I felt 72 years old. I felt the weight of a divorce that had stripped me down to almost nothing. I felt the ache in my knees from the cold, and the loneliness of a Tuesday morning with no particular reason to get dressed before 9. What I did not feel, sitting across from my son at my small kitchen table, was surprised. Nathan had his father's habit of delivering bad news like it was a favor. He would soften his posture, lower his voice just slightly, and tilt his head in a way that was meant to look like sympathy, but never quite got there. He was 44 years old, and he had been practicing that expression since he was a teenager, and I had never once told him how transparent it was. "Mom," he said, wrapping both hands around the coffee mug I had set in front of him, "I think you need to hear this before the formal reading." I looked at him. "Then say it." He exhaled slowly. "Margaret passed away 3 weeks ago. You already knew that." "I knew that." "The estate." He paused, set the mug down. "It's substantial, bigger than most people realized. The attorneys are putting it at somewhere around $28 million once everything is valued and liquid assets are counted. $28 million. I turned the number over in my mind the way you turn a smooth stone in your palm, feeling its weight, testing its edges. Margaret Whitmore had always been careful with money, methodical. She saved where others spent and invested where others hesitated. And the result, apparently, was 28 million reasons for my son to drive 40 minutes to my apartment on a Tuesday morning. "And?" I said. Nathan's jaw tightened, just barely. "And I think you need to be realistic, Mom. You and Margaret have been divorced for, 18 years? The terms of the settlement were finalized a long time ago. You walked away from the marriage, you chose to walk away." That last sentence landed the way he intended it to, like a reminder, like a small blade. "I know what I chose," I said. "Right, so." He folded his hands on the table. "You're not in the will. At least, not in the way you might be hoping. I just didn't want you to walk into that reading and be blindsided." I looked at my son for a long moment. He was wearing a good coat. He had always had good taste in clothing, even as a boy. He got that from Margaret, actually, the appreciation for quality fabric, the unconscious way he assessed a room for what things were worth. He was watching me with that tilted head expression, waiting for my reaction. "You've read the will," I said. Something moved across his face, fast, gone before I could name it precisely, but I'd been reading Nathan's expression since before he could walk, and what I saw in that half second was not sympathy. It was relief. The particular relief of a man who has already secured what he came to protect. "The attorney shared some details with the family," he said carefully. "As a courtesy." "Which attorney?" "Charles Whitmore, Margaret's estate lawyer. He was her cousin's son, actually. You might remember him." I remembered Charles Whitmore very well. He had been 26 years old the first time I met him, a nervous young man who wore shirts that were slightly too large, and had the habit of pulling at his collar when he was thinking hard. He had grown up since then, presumably. People did. "I remember him," I said. "He's handling everything. The reading is Friday." Nathan picked up the mug again. "I just thought you should know. going in with the right expectations. So you're not hurt. So you're not hurt. I thought about how often those 4 words had been used on me throughout my life as a way to preemptively justify someone else's behavior. So you're not hurt, as if the person saying it was the one protecting you and not the one who had already decided what your pain was allowed to look like. Thank you for coming all this way to tell me, I said. He looked slightly relieved. Of course, you're my mother. We sat there a few more minutes, talking about nothing in particular. He asked about my neighbor, a woman named Sandra who grew tomatoes on her balcony and sometimes brought me jars of sauce in August. I told him the tomatoes hadn't done well this year. He nodded like that was meaningful. When he left, I stood at the window and watched him walk to his car, a silver sedan, new model, parked slightly too close to the hydrant. He didn't look back up at the building. He had done what he came to do. I stayed at the window for a while after his car turned the corner. Then I went to the back of my closet and pulled out a gray metal box that I kept behind 2 stacked pairs of winter boots. The box was locked. I had the key on a ring with 3 others, attached to a small wooden carving of a bird that Margaret had brought back from a business trip to Oregon many years ago, before things between us had gone the way they went. I sat down on the edge of the bed with the box on my lap, and I did not open it yet. I just held it. There are things you keep for 18 years, not because you plan to use them, but because you cannot bring yourself to let go of what they mean. This box was one of those things. Inside it were documents, carefully preserved, sealed in archival sleeves the way a person seals something they want to last. And a letter in Margaret's handwriting that I had read so many times I could have recited it from memory. I had never shown these documents to Nathan. I had never shown them to anyone, not because I was hiding them exactly, but because Margaret and I had made an agreement a long time ago, and I had honored that agreement with a discipline that sometimes felt indistinguishable from self-erasure. Now Margaret was gone, and Nathan had looked at me across my own kitchen table and told me, with that careful voice, that I was getting nothing. Margaret Whitmore and I had met when I was 31 years old, and she was 28. I want to be honest about who we were to each other, because the story of this inheritance does not make sense without understanding the full shape of what Margaret and I actually built, not just as partners, not just as spouses, but as 2 people who were in many ways extensions of each other's ambitions for a long time before either of us had the language to say so. She was brilliant. I need to say that plainly, without softening it. Margaret had a mind that operated 3 steps ahead of any room she walked into, and she was driven in the way that certain people are driven. Not by desperation or fear, exactly, but by an almost constitutional need to see a thing she had imagined become real. She could take an idea that was still rough and unformed and work it into something viable with a focus that was honestly awe-inspiring to watch. What she was not, and this is important, was patient with the human side of business, with the relationships, with the slow work of trust building that turns a promising concept into something that actually survives contact with the real world. That was where I came in. When we met, I was working as a development director for a mid-sized nonprofit in a city we both eventually left. I was good at my job in a way that was somewhat invisible from the outside. I was good at listening, at reading what people needed, at making people feel that their investment in something was genuinely valued rather than strategically acknowledged. These are not glamorous skills. They do not make headlines. But they are the difference, in 100 different business situations, between a deal that closes and one that quietly falls apart at the seams. Margaret saw that in me almost immediately. She told me once, early on, that I was the only person she had ever met who could walk into a room full of skeptical people and walk out with every one of them feeling like they had made a friend. She said it like a compliment. It was, I think, also an assessment. We married when I was 34. She was 31, and already in the early stages of building what would eventually become the cornerstone of her estate, a regional property development company called Whitmore Partners that started with 2 modest commercial properties and grew, over the next 15 years, into something that none of our original investors could have predicted. I want to be careful here, because I am not interested in rewriting history to make myself sound more important than I was. Margaret was the architect of Whitmore Partners. Her name was on it. Her vision drove it. She made decisions that I sometimes disagreed with and was occasionally proven right about when I thought she was wrong. But there is a difference between being the architect of something and being the only person who built it. In the early years, the years that mattered most, the years when the company was fragile and every relationship was load-bearing, I worked alongside Margaret in every way that actually counted. I cultivated the investors. I managed the community relationships that made the zoning approvals possible. I traveled to meetings she didn't have time to attend and represented the company with her full authority because she trusted me to do it right. I negotiated contracts she couldn't negotiate without creating the impression that Whitmore Partners was too hungry, too aggressive, too willing to show its hand. I was, in the clearest possible terms, the other half of what that company was. But because my name was not on the letterhead, and because Margaret and I had made a deliberate strategic decision in those early years to present a unified public identity under her name for reasons that were legitimate at the time and that I agreed to, my contribution lived almost entirely in documents that most people never saw. Private agreements, deferred compensation arrangements, a partnership structure that existed on paper and had been honored quietly between the two of us for years. When the marriage ended, those documents became the most contested thing we had. I should tell you about the divorce because Nathan's version of it, the version he had clearly been operating on for 18 years, was not exactly accurate. He believed I had walked away. That was the word he used this morning, chosen carefully, I was sure. You walked away from the marriage. You chose to walk away. What actually happened was more complicated and considerably less flattering to everyone involved, including me. Margaret and I fell apart gradually, the way long partnerships often do. Not in a single dramatic rupture, but in a slow accumulation of distances. We disagreed about the direction of the company in ways that became personal. We disagreed about Nathan, who was living with us at the time, and who had inherited, I sometimes thought, the worst tendencies of both of us. My capacity for silence and her talent for using that silence as a weapon. There were months of cold rooms and careful conversations, and the particular exhaustion of two people who love each other, and have also, somewhere along the way, stopped being able to be in the same room without bracing themselves. And then there was the situation with Derek Paulson. Derek was a business partner of Margaret's, a man she had brought into Whitmore Partners as a co-investor on 2 significant projects, a man I had disliked from the first time I met him for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate, but that turned out, years later, to be correct. He was the kind of man who was charming in proportion to what he needed from you, and considerably less charming once he had it. I found out, in the way that you find things out when you live with someone, that Margaret's relationship with Derek had crossed lines that our marriage had been built on. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I handled the discovery gracefully, because I didn't. I was 54 years old, and I had spent 20 years building a life with this woman, and I did not handle it gracefully at all. What I did eventually was make a choice. I chose to leave. Not because I stopped loving Margaret, and this is the part Nathan never understood, the part I never fully explained to him, but because staying in the state we were in would have destroyed the company. Our conflict, if it had gone public, if it had turned litigious in the way it could have, would have unraveled Whitmore Partners at a critical juncture. There were projects in mid-development. There were investors whose confidence depended on the perception of stability. There were employees, about 43 of them at that point, whose livelihoods were connected to whether Whitmore Partners remained viable. Margaret knew all of this. I knew all of this. And so we did something that required, I think, more maturity than either of us fully had at the time. We sat down together with Charles Whitmore, young Charles, collar-pulling Charles, and we made arrangements. I would leave. I would accept a settlement that looked from the outside like a clean exit, a modest sum, the apartment we had bought as an investment property, and a private document that acknowledged my contribution to the company and established a deferred interest in its future value. That document lived in my gray metal box for 18 years, and now Margaret was dead, and Nathan had sat at my kitchen table and told me I was getting nothing, with the expression of a man who was already counting what he'd secured. I spent the 2 days before the will reading doing very ordinary things. I went to the market on Wednesday and bought the ingredients for a soup I hadn't made in years, a slow potato and leek soup that my mother used to make in winter, that took most of an afternoon to get right. I made it carefully, following the old rhythm of it, and I ate it over 2 days with bread from the bakery on Clement Street. I called my friend Rosalie, who was 70 and lived in Tucson and had known me for 40 years, and had the particular quality of friendship that allows for long silences without either person feeling the need to fill them. We talked for an hour about her garden, about a documentary she had watched, about the way the seasons had been behaving strangely for years now. She did not ask me about the will reading. I had not told her about it yet. I took long walks. I slept more than I usually did. I did not call Nathan back when he sent a text on Thursday that said, simply, "Just checking in. The reading is tomorrow at 10. Let me know if you need a ride." I did not need a ride. I had managed my own transportation for 18 years, and I would manage it tomorrow. What I did, on Thursday evening, was open the gray metal box. I took out the documents one by one, and I read them carefully, the way you read something not to learn from it, but to confirm what you already know. The private partnership agreement, the deferred interest structure. The letter from Margaret, dated 11 years ago, which was the one document in the box I had not expected. She had written it in her particular handwriting, quick and slightly left-leaning, the way people write when they are thinking faster than their hand wants to move. And she had addressed it to me by the nickname she had used for me in private for most of our marriage. "Ev," it began. "I'm not going to reproduce the whole letter here. Some things are private even now, even in the telling of a story like this. But I will tell you that Margaret, in her own words, in her own handwriting, had confirmed everything I knew about what we had built together. She had explained, with a clarity I had not expected from her on this particular subject, why she had made the arrangements she was making. She had spoken about Nathan in terms that were honest to the point of being painful. And at the end, she had written, "I know you won't fight for this on your own. You never did. So I'm going to make it so you don't have to." I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I put everything back in the box, locked it, and set it by the door so I would not forget it in the morning. Friday arrived the way important days often do, unremarkably. All gray light and ordinary sounds from the street, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the smell of someone else's coffee drifting from somewhere down the hall. I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but because I had learned, over 72 years, that the way you dress is a kind of message you send before you open your mouth, and I wanted my message to be legible. I wore a dark green dress I had owned for many years, well-made and well-maintained, with a wool coat I had bought 2 winters ago in a shade of charcoal that I thought suited me. I put on the small pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I looked at myself in the mirror for a moment, the way you do when you are trying to see yourself the way a stranger would. An old woman, composed, carrying a gray metal box. I called a car and I rode in silence to the offices of Whitmore and Associates, on the 14th floor of a building downtown that I had visited in another life many times. The elevator was slow. When the doors opened, I stepped into a waiting room full of people who all, in their various ways, stopped talking when they saw me. Nathan was there, standing near the window with a woman I recognized as his wife, Carolyn. He looked at the box under my arm and then at my face, and something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but I caught it. A small recalibration, a flicker of something he hadn't expected to feel. Around the room were cousins, a nephew, 2 people I didn't recognize who were likely affiliated with financial institutions. The kind of gathering that assembles itself around the question of money, drawn in from various distances by the particular gravity of a substantial estate. They looked at me the way people look at someone they have already decided is not a threat. I found a chair and I sat down. I set the box on my lap, and I waited. A door opened across the room, and Charles Whitmore, older now, heavier in the face, but with the same habit of pulling at his collar, stepped into the doorway and looked around the room. His eyes found mine. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he gave a very small nod. "If everyone is ready," he said, "we can begin." Charles Whitmore's conference room was the kind of room designed to communicate seriousness before anyone opened their mouth. Dark wood table, high-backed chairs, a long window overlooking the city that let in gray winter light without letting in any warmth. There were water glasses set out at each seat, a small stack of folders near Charles's chair at the head of the table, and the particular quality of silence that fills a room when everyone in it is pretending to be calm. I took a seat near the middle of the table, not at the far end where I might have been easy to overlook, and not near the head where I would have been conspicuous. I set the gray metal box on the table in front of me. A few people glanced at it. I did not explain it. Nathan sat across and 2 seats down, positioned, I noticed, close to Charles's end of the table. His wife Carolyn was beside him, wearing a cream-colored blouse and a careful expression. She was a measured woman, Carolyn, the kind who processed everything before she showed anything, and she had never been unkind to me exactly. But she had also, over the years, absorbed Nathan's version of the family story without visible resistance, and that was its own kind of position. To Nathan's left was Margaret's nephew, Gerald Whitmore, a man in his early 60s who had worked tangentially with the company for years in a capacity that always seemed slightly unclear to me. He had Margaret's sharp nose and none of her sharpness, and he had dressed today in a way that suggested he believed the occasion called for celebration. New shoes, a tie with a faint shimmer in it. There were 2 other people at the table I placed as attorneys or financial representatives. They had the particular quality of professional neutrality that comes with being paid by the hour to be present. They introduced themselves to no one and watched the room with the mild attentiveness of people taking notes in their heads. Charles set his reading glasses on his nose and looked around the table once, the way a person does when they are counting, confirming, preparing. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "Before we begin the formal reading, I want to clarify the process. Margaret Whitmore's estate documents are extensive and include several components beyond the primary will. I'll be reading the will itself first, and then addressing additional documentation in the order Margaret specified. Please hold questions until I've finished each section. Some of what I'm going to present today may require context before it makes complete sense, so I'm asking everyone to be patient with the sequence." He paused. Gerald shifted in his chair. Nathan's hands, folded on the table, tightened slightly. "Margaret passed away on the 14th of last month," Charles continued, "following a period of illness that she managed privately, consistent with how she managed most things in her life. She completed her final revisions to these documents 8 months ago, in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary, and she was of clear and documented sound mind at the time of signing. I want that on record before anything else." I thought, 8 months ago. I thought about what Margaret had known 8 months ago, about her own condition, about what was coming, about the choices she was making, and I felt something move through me that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it. The particular ache of understanding that someone you loved had been carrying something heavy and alone. Charles opened the first folder. I'll begin with the primary bequests. What followed was, for the first several minutes, approximately what the room had expected. There were provisions for charitable organizations Margaret had supported, a literacy foundation, an urban greening initiative, a scholarship fund at her alma mater. These were specific dollar amounts, carefully designated, and Charles read them in a steady voice that gave nothing away. Then came the business interests. Whitmore Partners, Charles said, including all associated real estate holdings, development contracts, and subsidiary interests, is to be placed in a managed trust for a period not less than 3 years, during which time a board of 3 trustees will oversee operations. The trustees named are, and here he listed 3 names, none of which were Nathan's, and I watched Nathan's expression go through something complicated in the space of about 4 seconds. His jaw did not actually drop, but something in his posture changed, a subtle deflation, like air going out of something that had been held too tightly. Gerald made a sound that was almost, but not quite, a word. "That can't be right," Gerald said. "She told me, we had discussed, Gerald." Charles's voice was patient in the way that people are patient when they have practiced patience specifically for this moment. "Please hold questions until I've finished." Gerald sat back. His new shoes made a small sound against the floor. Nathan said nothing. He was looking at the table. Carolyn put one hand briefly on his arm. Charles continued. He read through several more specific bequests, items of personal property, collections, the house in Vermont that Margaret had owned for 20 years and loved in the particular way that people love places they associate with being most themselves. These went to people I mostly recognized, old friends, a longtime housekeeper named Bet, who had been with Margaret for over 15 years, a former colleague I had met only a handful of times. Nathan received something. I want to be accurate about this. He was not cut out entirely. Margaret left him a sum that was, by most people's standards, significant, $250,000, designated specifically for what the document called educational or developmental purposes for his children, meaning Nathan's 2 teenage sons, my grandchildren, who I saw at holidays when Nathan remembered to include me. $250,000 in a trust for the grandchildren. Not for Nathan himself. Not for Carolyn. For the boys, with Nathan as manager, but with Charles as oversight trustee until both boys reached adulthood. Nathan looked up from the table when Charles finished reading that section. He looked at me. I don't know what he expected to find on my face. I gave him nothing. I want to be clear, Nathan said, and his voice had changed. The careful softness of Tuesday morning was gone, and what was underneath it was harder and less managed. That this is not what Margaret and I discussed. She told me specifically, I have texts, I have messages. Nathan. This time Charles's patience had an edge in it. I understand this may not align with what you expected, but I have to complete the reading before we address any concerns. Margaret anticipated that there might be questions, which is part of why the documentation is structured the way it is. Please. Nathan closed his mouth. He looked like someone who had walked into a room expecting to be handed something and was only now beginning to understand that the room itself was different than he remembered. Gerald, across the table, was very still. His tie caught the light when he breathed. Charles turned a page. He took a breath of his own that was barely perceptible, but I had been watching him, and I noticed it. There is a separate document, Charles said, which Margaret designated as Addendum A to the primary will. It is legally binding, was signed under the same conditions as the will itself, and I'm required to read it in full before entertaining any discussion. I want to prepare everyone in the room for the fact that this addendum addresses matters predating the will by a significant number of years, and that some of you may not have been aware of the history it documents. He looked up, and his eyes, briefly, just briefly, moved to me. I felt the room shift, not physically, but the quality of attention in it changed, the way attention changes when people realize that what they thought was a peripheral detail is actually the center of something. Carolyn leaned slightly toward Nathan and said something in a low voice. Nathan shook his head once, a short, controlled movement. Charles began to read. The addendum opened with a formal recitation of dates and parties, standard legal language, the kind that establishes context before it delivers content. It named Whitmore Partners. It named the years of the company's founding and early development. And then it named me. Evelyn Hartwell, formerly Evelyn Whitmore, born 1952, of record as co-developer of Whitmore Partners during the period 1985 through 2006. I heard Nathan make a sound. A small sound, involuntary, controlled almost immediately. Co-developer. Not spouse. Not supportive partner. Co-developer. Of record. Charles continued reading, and what he read was, in essence, the history that I had carried in my gray metal box for 18 years, but in Margaret's voice, structured with legal precision, entered into the official record of her estate. It described the nature of my contribution to the company. It named specific projects, specific negotiations, specific investor relationships that I had managed. It referenced the private partnership agreement we had signed in 1989 and the deferred compensation arrangement that had been maintained, with annual acknowledgement from Margaret's attorney of record throughout and after our marriage. It documented clearly and without sentimentality that I had accepted a reduced public settlement in 2006 in exchange for a protected interest in the company's future value. An interest that had never been extinguished because the agreement that established it had never been voided, had in fact been renewed quietly every 5 years as both Margaret and I had agreed, and whose final renewal had taken place just over 3 years ago, when Margaret had already known she was ill, when she had reached out to me through Charles with a document requiring only my signature and a notary to witness it. I had driven to the notary on a Thursday afternoon and not told anyone. The room was very quiet while Charles read. I looked at no one. I kept my hands flat on the table, one on either side of the gray metal box, and I breathed steadily, and I listened to my own history being read back to me in a formal voice, in a room full of people who were only now understanding that they had significantly misread the situation. When Charles finished the addendum, he set the pages down and removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose once. Under the terms of the addendum, he said, and consistent with the private partnership agreement and its subsequent renewals, the estate is directed to recognize Ms. Evelyn Hartwell's protected interest as legally prior to any other distribution from the portion of Whitmore Partners' value attributable to the developmental period of 1985 through 2006. The valuation of that interest, as calculated by the estate's financial advisors using the methodology specified in the original agreement, is, he looked at the page, $14.3 million, Gerald said. That's, and then didn't finish the sentence. Carolyn put both hands in her lap. Nathan said, no, just that. A single flat word. Charles looked at him. Nathan, no, that's... Nathan's voice was controlled, but only barely, and I could hear under it the specific frequency of a man whose entire understanding of a situation has just inverted. She never mentioned, she told me this was settled. She told me the divorce settlement was final, and there was no outstanding. The divorce settlement addressed the marital property division, Charles said, in a voice that was careful and not unkind, but also not yielding. It did not and could not address the separate business partnership agreement, which existed independent of the marriage and was not subject to divorce proceedings. Margaret was explicit about this distinction in the addendum. She was also explicit about the fact that she chose not to disclose the agreement's ongoing existence to family members because she was concerned about interference. That last word landed in the room the way certain words do, quietly, but with weight. Interference. Nathan heard it. His head turned toward me, and the look on his face was one I had never quite seen from him before. Not anger exactly. Not yet. Something more confused than anger. The particular bewilderment of a person who thought they understood a story and has just discovered they were only ever reading a summary. Mom, he said. His voice had changed again, quieter now. Did you know about this? I looked at my son. He was 44 years old, and he was sitting in a conference room chair with $250,000 designated for his children's futures and nothing designated for himself. And he was looking at me with an expression that I could read in full, but that I took a moment to answer because I wanted to choose my words the way you choose footing when you're crossing something uncertain. I knew about the agreement, I said. I signed it. I renewed it. I kept copies of everything in that box for 18 years. So yes, Nathan, I knew. The silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence in the room all morning. Gerald found his voice first. This is outrageous, he said, and there was real feeling in it. Not grief, not confusion, but the specific outrage of a man who had calculated his share of something and is watching the math change. This agreement, if it even exists the way you're describing it, was never disclosed to the family. Margaret had an obligation. Margaret had an obligation to her estate's legal structure, Charles said, and this time the patience in his voice was nearly gone, which she fulfilled completely. The agreement is valid, documented, and witnessed. The addendum is valid, documented, and witnessed. The interest Ms. Hartwell holds predates several of the bequests named in the primary will and takes precedence accordingly. He looked at Gerald directly. I understand this is difficult, but what you're describing as outrageous is actually a woman honoring a 20-year commitment to her business partner. Gerald sat back. His tie had stopped shimmering. He looked smaller than he had when he walked in. I put my hands around the gray metal box and did not say anything. Nathan was not done. I knew him well enough to know that. He had gone quiet the way he went quiet when he was reorganizing, when the first approach had been blocked, and he was already finding the next one. I want to see the original documents, he said to Charles. The 1989 agreement, the renewals, all of it, before any of this moves forward. That's your right, Charles said. Copies will be made available to all parties by end of business today. You may retain your own counsel to review them. I would expect nothing less, and neither would the estate. However, he paused and straightened the papers in front of him. Margaret also anticipated this. There's one additional component of the addendum I haven't read yet. Nathan's jaw tightened. What component? Charles put his glasses back on. Margaret included a personal statement, he said. Not a legal document. It's not binding in any formal sense. But she directed me to read it in this room to everyone present before the meeting concluded. Gerald made a small sound of disbelief. Carolyn's expression had gone very careful. Nathan said nothing. He was watching Charles with the focused, controlled attention of someone who has decided that processing emotion later is more useful than showing it now. He got that from Margaret, that particular quality. I had always known it. Charles cleared his throat and unfolded a single sheet of paper that was visibly different from the legal documents. Personal stationery, cream-colored, with Margaret's initials at the top. He read, "To those gathered for the reading of my will, I am aware that some of what has been documented today will come as a surprise. I made a deliberate choice not to address these matters before my death in a more informal or direct way, because I know the people in this room well enough to know that informal and direct would not have been sufficient. Some things require the weight of legal record to be taken seriously, and that says more about us than I am entirely comfortable with. I want to say something about Evelyn. There is a version of our story that most people know, and it is not wrong exactly. It is simply incomplete. Evelyn was my partner, in the full meaning of that word, in every context in which it applies, for more than 20 years. She chose, at a moment that cost her considerably more than she ever showed, to protect something we had both built instead of protecting her own claim to it. She did this quietly. She did this without asking for recognition. She did this, I believe, because she understood that the work itself was worth more than the credit for it, and that understanding is rarer than I knew when I was young enough to take it for granted. I am not leaving Evelyn money. I am returning to her what is already hers. There is a difference. I hope, by the time this is read, that difference is clear to everyone in the room. To my son, Nathan, I love you. I have loved you in the complicated, imperfect way that parents love children when they also see their own failures reflected in them. What I hope for you, more than any financial provision, more than any inheritance, is that you find a way to understand the difference between someone who is quiet and someone who has nothing to say. Your mother has never had nothing to say. She chose for most of your life to say it only when it mattered. I hope you learn, before it costs you more than it has already, to listen for the difference. M.W. Charles folded the letter and set it down. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I was looking at the table. I was looking at the grain of the dark wood, and I was doing the thing I had learned to do in rooms where I needed to hold myself together. I was breathing slowly, and I was not thinking about the letter as a whole. I was just letting one word at a time settle without letting any of them break me open, because I was not going to cry in this room in front of these people. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I had not come here to perform grief or gratitude or anything else. I had come here to sit in a chair and be present for the truth. And the truth had arrived, and I needed to stay upright inside it. Nathan pushed back his chair. It was a controlled movement, not a storm out, but it was also not nothing. He stood up and straightened his jacket, and he looked at Charles and said, in a voice that was stripped of everything except the bare structure of composure, "I'll need those documents by end of day." "They'll be ready," Charles said. Nathan looked at me, and I looked at him. And for a moment there was something between us that was not anger and not reconciliation and not anything simple enough to name easily. It was the look of two people who are bound to each other by the deepest possible tie, and who are, in this moment, on opposite sides of something real. Something that is going to have to be dealt with in the long run, in the ordinary days that come after dramatic ones. "We'll talk," he said to me. "Yes," I said, "we will." He walked out. Carolyn followed, and she paused at the door for just a moment, long enough to look at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something between apology and restraint, and then she was gone. Gerald left without speaking to me or to Charles, which was, I thought, probably the most honest thing he had done all morning. The two financial representatives packed their folders with the practiced efficiency of people who have witnessed scenes like this before, and who have learned that the most professional thing they can do in the aftermath is be invisible about it. And then it was just me and Charles in the conference room, with the gray winter light coming through the long window and the water glasses still mostly full and untouched. Charles sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath that he had clearly been holding for most of the last hour. "She planned this very carefully," I said. "She did," he said. "She spent the better part of 8 months on the sequencing alone. She wanted it to be airtight, she wanted there to be no procedural angle that could be used to challenge it. He paused. She also wanted it read in that order. The will first, so people had settled into what they thought was the full picture. Then the addendum. Then the letter. She always did have a sense of structure. Charles smiled at that briefly. He had known Margaret for a long time too, in his own way. She did. I looked down at the gray metal box. I had carried it here, and it sat between us now, and everything inside it had been, in a sense, superseded. The estate's own documents were more comprehensive, more legally fortified than anything in my box. But I had carried it anyway because there is something about holding your own proof that no copy or filing can fully replace. She could have told me, I said. Not accusatory, just true. At some point in the last 8 months, she could have reached out. Let me know what she was doing. Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, She did, actually, in her way. He opened one of the remaining folders and slid a sealed envelope across the table toward me. She asked me to give you this privately, after the room cleared. The envelope had my name on it, Evelyn, her handwriting. I put my hand on it but didn't open it, not yet. Can I ask you something? I said to Charles. Of course. Nathan, did he know any of it before today? Charles considered his answer, and the consideration itself told me something. He knew that the will was being finalized. He had been in contact with the office, not with me, but with the firm's paralegal, requesting information about the estate structure. He knew the approximate total value. He had been told, accurately, that the will would be read on Friday and that he was named as a beneficiary. Charles paused. He was not told the terms of the addendum, because the addendum's contents were restricted per Margaret's specific instruction. He was not told about the partnership agreement or its current status. But he came to my apartment on Tuesday, I said, and told me I was getting nothing. He said it with a great deal of confidence. Charles met my eyes. I noticed that too. We sat with that for a moment. What it meant, I thought, was that Nathan had made an assumption, a confident, deeply held assumption based on his understanding of the family's history, his understanding of my position in it, and his understanding of what a 72-year-old divorced woman with a small apartment and no visible power was likely to receive from an estate of this size. He had done the math as he understood it, and the math had come out clearly, and he had driven 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning to deliver the result with the expression of a man performing a kindness. He had not known, but he had assumed, and the assumption had been built on something, on years of watching me be quiet, be small, be manageable, on a story about me that he had been telling himself long enough that it had stopped being a story and become, in his mind, a fact. That was, in its own way, the most painful part. Not that he had wanted me excluded, but that he had simply never considered that I might be otherwise. I picked up the sealed envelope. I'm going to go home, I said. Of course. Charles stood. Evelyn, the financial team will be in touch next week to begin the transfer process. There will be paperwork, and some of it will take time, but the structure is clean, and Margaret made sure there are no ambiguities in the numbers. You shouldn't encounter complications. And if Nathan contests it, Charles's expression did not change in a way that suggested concern. He can retain counsel and review the documents. I'd be surprised if any attorney he consults suggested a viable path to contest given the documentation. But that's his right, and if it goes that direction, the estate is fully prepared. I nodded. I put on my coat. I picked up the gray metal box under one arm and the envelope in my other hand, and I walked to the door of the conference room. I stopped. Charles, I said without turning around. Thank you for reading all of it the way she wanted. It was what she asked, he said, but it was also the right thing. I walked out through the waiting room, which was empty now, and I took the slow elevator down to the lobby and pushed through the glass doors into the cold. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, moving, indifferent, full of its own concerns. A bus went by. A woman with a stroller navigated the curb. 2 men in work jackets talked near a truck with a company logo on the side. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the envelope in my hand and the box under my arm. Then I called a car and waited. And while I waited, I did not open the envelope because I was not ready yet, and the cold was settling around me in a way that was uncomfortable but also clarifying, the way cold sometimes is, and I let myself stand in it and feel exactly how tired I was, how much the last week had cost me, how strange it was to have spent 18 years carrying something in a locked box and to have that thing suddenly become real and large and visible in a room full of people who had not known it existed. The car arrived. I got in. I gave the driver my address. I set the box on the seat beside me and held the envelope in both hands and looked out the window at the city going past. $14.3 million. Not a gift. Not a charity. Not the grudging acknowledgement of a woman the family had already decided to forget. A debt being paid. A partnership being honored. A truth being put on record in a room full of people who had organized their understanding of me around my silence. The driver was playing something low on the radio, something instrumental and unhurried. I leaned my head back against the seat. I thought about the letter inside the envelope. I thought about Nathan's face when Charles read the words, "Your mother has never had nothing to say." I thought about the gray metal box and the 18 years of Tuesday mornings that had passed while I kept it locked and did not explain myself and simply continued. Went to the market, made soup, talked to Rosalie, watched the tomatoes fail, got dressed before 9 or didn't. I thought about Margaret writing that letter on cream stationery with her initials at the top, knowing she would not be in the room when it was read, knowing she would not see the faces, knowing the only thing she could control at that point was the precision of the words. She had always controlled what she could. It was one of the most aggravating things about her. It was also, I thought now, one of the most Margaret things about her. The car turned onto my street. I had not opened the envelope by the time I got home. I carried it inside with the box and set both of them on the kitchen table. The same table where Nathan had sat 3 days ago with his careful expression and his confident news. And I stood in the kitchen in my good coat and my mother's earrings, and I allowed myself, finally, to feel the full weight of what had happened that morning. Not the money. That would take time to become real. But the other thing. The thing that happens when the truth you have been holding alone for a very long time is finally spoken out loud in front of witnesses. When it is read in a formal voice, in a formal room, and entered into a record that cannot be quietly revised or conveniently forgotten. I had been seen. Not because I fought for it, but because Margaret had done what she always did. She had found the most precise, most complete, most structurally sound way to make something true that she needed to be true. I took off my coat. I hung it carefully on the hook by the door. I went to the kitchen and put on the kettle. And I sat down at the table with the envelope, and I finally opened it. The envelope was not sealed with anything fancy, just the standard adhesive flap, pressed down firmly the way Margaret pressed everything, with a completeness that left no room for ambiguity. I slid my finger along the edge and pulled out 2 sheets of paper folded together, and I set them flat on the kitchen table while the kettle came to a boil behind me. The tea could wait. I read the letter twice before I allowed myself to feel anything about it. The first time through was just gathering, taking in the words in sequence, noting where her handwriting changed pressure, where she had paused and restarted a sentence, the places where the pen had moved more slowly. Margaret's handwriting was a kind of record of her thinking, and I had learned to read it that way over decades. When she was certain, she wrote quickly, and the letters leaned forward like they were trying to get somewhere. When she was working something out, the letters straightened up, became more deliberate. The first half of the letter was quick. The second half was not. She opened with something practical, which was so entirely Margaret that I almost laughed out loud sitting there alone in my kitchen. She told me that Charles had full authority to answer questions about the transfer process, and that the financial team, a firm called Mercer and Associates, which I had never heard of, but which she described as thorough and discreet, would contact me within 10 business days. She noted that she had made sure the liquid portions were structured for accessibility, meaning I would not be waiting years while assets were slowly converted. She had thought about the practical experience of receiving this, not just the legal mechanism of it, and that attention to the receiving end of things was something I had always loved about her, and sometimes resented because it was so hard to argue with a person who had already considered your discomfort and planned around it. Then the tone changed. I could see it in the handwriting before I even read the words, the slight slowing, the increased pressure. Ev, she wrote, which was what she had always called me in private and only in private, and seeing it in her handwriting on paper I was holding in my own hands was harder than I expected. I have been trying to write this part for 3 weeks, and I keep starting over, which you would find funny because you know I have never had difficulty saying what I mean. The truth is, I don't have difficulty saying it. I have difficulty with what I want to say making any difference now, when the time for it making a difference has mostly passed. I was not a good partner to you toward the end. I want to say that without qualification, without explanation, without the but that I have spent years attaching to it in my own head, I was not a good partner. You gave more than you took for most of our marriage, and in the years when it counted most, the early years of the company, the years when we were both exhausted and frightened and pretending to each other that we weren't, you showed up with a consistency that I have never adequately acknowledged. What Derek was is something I don't need to explain to you. You understood it better than I did at the time, which is another thing I was not ready to acknowledge when it would have meant something. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am past the age of organizing my requests around outcomes I cannot control. What I'm asking, and I know you will read this as a request, even if I don't frame it that way, because you have always known how I think, is that you take what is yours without arguing yourself out of it. I know you. I know the version of you that will look at $14 million and find 17 reasons why it feels like too much, why you should set most of it aside, why you don't need it, why someone else deserves it more. I have watched you argue yourself into a smaller life for the better part of 2 decades, and I am asking you, with whatever authority I have left from this side of things, to stop. You built something real. Take up the space it earned you. The second thing I want to say is about Nathan. Here her handwriting slowed even further, and there were 2 words crossed out in the margin that I couldn't fully make out, which meant she had been writing this part without full certainty, feeling her way through. Nathan is going to be angry, not just at the estate arrangements. He will get past those eventually, when his attorney explains that the documentation is airtight and a contest would cost more than it could possibly recover. He will be angry at me. At you. At the story he thought he knew about us because he has been operating on that story for a long time, and discovering that a story is incomplete is not a comfortable experience. I know this because I spent the last 2 years of our marriage operating on a story about you that was also incomplete, and being wrong about someone you love is one of the most disorienting things a person can experience. Do not manage his anger for him. I know that is your instinct, to absorb it, to make it smaller, to find a way to smooth the surface so that the relationship can continue. You have been doing that with Nathan since he was 14 years old, and it has not served either of you. Let him feel what he feels. Let him come to you when he is ready. And when he does, and I think he will, because he is not a bad person, he is just a person who was never asked to look closely at his assumptions, do not make it easy by pretending you were never hurt. You were hurt. It is allowed to have been real. I love you, Ev, in the way that does not expire and does not require anything from you to remain true. I should have said it more directly when I had the opportunity. I am saying it now because it is accurate and because some things deserve to be on record. M. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I finished reading. The kettle had long since stopped steaming. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the afternoon had gotten darker, the way November afternoons do in this city. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a slow fading that you don't quite notice until the room is dim and you haven't turned on a light. I got up and turned on the light above the stove. I made the tea. I stood at the counter and drank half of it while it was still too hot, which I have always done and which has always been a mistake. And the familiar small burn of it was, oddly, steadying. Take up the space it earned you. I thought about what that meant. Not the money, specifically. The money was real and it would require real decisions, and those decisions would come. I was not pretending otherwise. But the principle underneath the money, the idea that I had earned a certain amount of room in the world and had been, for 18 years, choosing to occupy only the smallest corner of it. Not because anyone had forced me, because I had made a series of small choices, each of which seemed reasonable individually and which had accumulated into a habit of smallness that I had eventually stopped noticing. You get used to the size of the space you live in. I was still thinking about that when my phone rang. It was not Nathan. It was Carolyn. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Some instinct that said this call was different. That Carolyn calling me directly and not through Nathan meant something worth knowing. "Evelyn," she said. Her voice was careful but not cold. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling." "It's okay," I said. A brief pause. I don't know exactly what I wanted. I've been sitting in the car for the last 20 minutes trying to figure out how to have this conversation. "Nathan doesn't know you're calling." It was not a question. She was quiet for a moment. "No, he doesn't." "All right," I said. I carried my tea to the table and sat back down. "Then just say what you came to say." Another pause, longer. I could hear road noise, which meant she was still in the car, parked somewhere. "I want to say that I'm sorry." Not for today exactly. I don't think today was my thing to be sorry for, but for the last several years, for how Nathan talks about you, and for the fact that I let it happen in our house without pushing back. I told myself it wasn't my place, but I think it was easier not to. I held the phone and I looked at the letter on the table in front of me. "He loves you," Carolyn said. "I know it doesn't look like that right now. It didn't look like it this morning, but he does, and he's scared. He went in there today expecting something specific, and what he got instead was a completely different version of his family's history, and Nathan does not do well with things he didn't see coming." "He never has," I said. "I know." A small exhale. I didn't want you to be alone tonight thinking that no one." She stopped. Started again. "I don't think you got nothing for 18 years, Evelyn. I think you got treated like you were nothing, and that's different, and I should have said something about it a long time ago." I did not expect that sentence. It moved through me in a way that I had to absorb carefully, standing still inside it, before I could respond. "Thank you," I said. "That means something." "I know it's probably not enough," she said, "but it's what I have right now." We spoke for a few more minutes, about the boys, about logistics that didn't need to be resolved tonight, about nothing that required resolution. When we hung up, the kitchen felt slightly different than it had before the call. Not solved, not warm exactly, but less sealed. I thought about what Margaret had said. He is not a bad person. He is just a person who was never asked to look closely at his assumptions. I thought about Carolyn sitting in a parked car for 20 minutes, working up to an apology she didn't have to make. I thought about the fact that families are not just the people in them, but the stories those people have agreed, consciously or not, to tell each other about who everyone is, and that revising those stories is one of the most painful and necessary things a family can do. I did not call Nathan that night. Margaret had told me not to manage his anger for him, and she was right. And I was going to honor that even though every instinct I had wanted to pick up the phone and find a way to make the surface smooth again. I ate the leftover soup. I read for a while. I slept eventually, though not easily. The next several days were their own kind of strange. Charles's office sent the documents by courier the following Monday. Not just copies, but a full indexed package of everything. The 1989 agreement, the 4 subsequent renewals, the financial analysis establishing the valuation, the addendum itself with its notarizations, the supporting correspondence between Margaret and her attorneys going back years. It arrived in a large envelope, and I sat at the kitchen table and went through it piece by piece, cross-referencing it against the documents in the gray metal box, and everything aligned. Every date, every figure, every clause. Margaret had been meticulous. She had been building this for a long time. I called Rosalie that evening and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was one of Rosalie's great qualities. She understood that some things needed to be said in full before they needed to be responded to. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 14 million. Yes. Evelyn. I know. What are you going to do with it? And I said something that surprised even me, sitting there in my kitchen with the full indexed package of my financial future spread out on the table in front of me. I don't know yet, but for the first time in 18 years, I get to decide. Rosalie said quietly. Good. What I did not tell Rosalie, what I had not told anyone, was that 3 days after the reading, I had received a different kind of correspondence. Not from Charles's office, not from the financial team. A handwritten note on plain paper in an envelope with no return address, postmarked from the same city. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Gerald Whitmore. The note was short. It said, "You should know that Nathan is not the only one who was misled. I was told specifically by someone I trusted that Margaret's private arrangements were straightforward and that the estate would be divided along lines that have been discussed in this family for years. I am not certain now who I was told this by or what their intention was, but I think you should be careful." That was it. No signature, though I knew who it was from. No further explanation. I read it twice, put it in the gray metal box with everything else. And I sat very still at the kitchen table thinking about the word careful. Someone had told Gerald that the estate would be divided in a specific way. Someone had been confident enough in that prediction to share it with him. The obvious candidate was Nathan, who had driven to my apartment and delivered the news of my exclusion with exactly the same confidence. But Nathan had told Charles he hadn't seen the actual documents, which meant either Nathan had been lying about that, or Nathan had made his prediction based on something other than the will itself. Based on what, then? I thought about the specific quality of his certainty on Tuesday morning. The word I had used to describe it to myself was relief. The relief of a man who has already secured what he came to protect. At the time, I had interpreted that as Nathan having convinced himself of the outcome he preferred. But Gerald's note introduced another possibility. That Nathan had had a conversation with someone at some point that gave him reason to believe the outcome was already settled, not knowledge of the will, something older, something that predated Margaret's death. I did not know yet what that something was. I put the note in the box, and I did not call Charles about it immediately because I needed to think carefully before I said anything to anyone about what I suspected. And I needed to be sure that what I suspected was actually supported by what I knew, rather than by the general pressure of the last week, which was the kind of pressure that could make a person see patterns that weren't there. But the note stayed with me. It changed the temperature of things. On the following Thursday, Nathan came to my apartment. He did not call ahead. He knocked on the door at 10 in the morning, and when I opened it, he was standing in the hallway looking like he had not slept well in several days, which was true of both of us. And he had his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression was not the careful performance of Tuesday. It was something more unguarded than that, which was either genuine or a more sophisticated version of the same performance, and I was not sure which yet. "Can I come in?" he said. I stepped back from the door. He came in and stood in the living room, looking around it as though he was seeing it for the first time or the last time, which are surprisingly similar ways of looking at a room. He had been here many times over the years, holidays, occasional dinners, the brief visits that people make when duty and affection are mixed together in proportions that aren't quite right either way. But he was looking at it now the way people look at things when they are trying to understand how they didn't see them clearly before. "Sit down, Nathan," I said. He sat. I sat across from him, the coffee table between us. I did not offer coffee, not because I was being unkind, but because I wanted to be present in this conversation without the business of making things. "I had my attorney review the documents," he said. "I know, Charles told me." A flicker of something. "He told you." "He let me know the review was happening and that he'd made the documents available. He didn't share anything else." Nathan nodded slowly. He was looking at his hands, which were clasped between his knees. "The documents are... There's no viable challenge. Berman, that's my attorney, he said there's nothing there. The agreement is airtight, and it's been consistently renewed, and the valuation methodology is solid, and the addendum is executed perfectly. He said whoever drew this up was very thorough." "Margaret was very thorough," I said. "Yeah." A pause. "She was." We sat in that for a moment. "I want to say something," Nathan said, "and I need you to let me get through it without interrupting me, because I've been working on it for 4 days, and if I stop, I'm not sure I'll be able to start again." "All right," I said. He looked up. He looked at me directly, which was harder for him than he made it appear. I knew this because I had watched him avoid direct eye contact his entire life, when the subject was something that cost him. "I went to your apartment on Tuesday," he said, "and I told you that you were getting nothing. I told you to be realistic. I told you—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "I told you that you had chosen to walk away. I said it like that was the whole story, like that was the truth of everything, the divorce, the company, all of it. And I need you to know that I know it wasn't the whole story. I know that now. I think I may have known it before, in some way I didn't want to look at directly, and I—" Another stop. His jaw worked. "I'm sorry. That's not enough for what I said. But I don't have anything bigger to offer right now except that I know I was wrong, and I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry." I let the silence sit after he finished. This was hard. I want to be honest about that. It was hard not because I was unmoved by what he said. I was moved considerably, and I was working to keep that off my face because this moment needed to be clear rather than emotional. It was hard because Nathan's apology was real and imperfect in the way that real apologies are, and it would have been very easy to accept it immediately, to pull him in, to smooth the surface and call it resolved. And Margaret had specifically told me not to do that, and Margaret was right. "I heard you," I said, "and I'm going to be honest with you because that's what this moment deserves. What you said to me on Tuesday, the way you said it, was not the first time you've treated me as though I had nothing of value to offer. It's been a pattern, Nathan, for years. The small ways you've made it clear that you saw me as diminished somehow, old, past the point of relevance. I let it happen because I chose my battles and I was tired, and I love you. But I'm not going to pretend that one apology, however sincere, settles all of it." Nathan was very still. He was looking at the table. "What I'm willing to do," I said, "is to not end this, to not decide that what happened this week is the final definition of who we are to each other. But I need you to understand that going forward is different from going back. We can't go back to the way things were, because the way things were wasn't working for me, and I'm done being quiet about that." He looked up. His eyes were red in a way that was recent. "Okay," he said. His voice was thick. "Okay, I understand that. There's something else," I said. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer." He waited. "Before the reading," I said, "you came to my apartment with a specific level of confidence about the outcome. You knew about the estate's total value, but you were certain I was excluded. Where did that certainty come from?" "Not a guess, Nathan. Something specific." Something moved through his expression, complicated and fast. I watched him consider, watched the decision happening in real time. The question of whether to deflect, whether to manage, whether to give me the partial truth that satisfied the letter of honesty while protecting something else. He didn't deflect. "Derek Paulson," he said. The name landed in the room, and I felt it the way you feel certain words, physically, somewhere in the chest. "Tell me," I said. Nathan exhaled. "I've been in contact with Derek on and off for about 3 years. After you and Margaret split, he stayed connected to some of the company's investors. He has relationships in that world. He told me a while ago, maybe 18 months ago, that Margaret had revised her estate plans and that the arrangements were, he said they were straightforward, family-focused. He made it sound like the divorce settlement had been the final word on anything involving you. And He stopped. I believed him. I shouldn't have. I didn't ask for documentation. He seemed to know what he was talking about, and it was what I expected to hear, so I believed it. I sat with that. Derek Paulson. The man who had been the rupture point in my marriage. The man I had recognized immediately as someone who operated at the intersection of charm and information, who understood that what people believed was often more powerful than what was true, who had apparently maintained enough proximity to Margaret's world to be a plausible source about her estate, and who had used that proximity to feed Nathan a version of events that served some purpose I didn't yet fully understand. Did Derek stand to benefit from the estate? I asked. Nathan hesitated. Not directly. He's not in the will. But another pause. He's been working with Gerald on a development project, something separate from Whitmore Partners, but adjacent. If the estate had been divided the way he implied it would be, Gerald would have had more resources to bring to that project. There it was, the shape of the thing. Derek had told Nathan what Nathan wanted to hear, and Nathan had carried that confidence to my apartment on Tuesday morning, and Derek's motivation had not been Nathan's interests at all. It had been Gerald's resources, and Derek's access to those resources through Gerald. And the quietest possible version of the story had been me receiving nothing and going home and staying small and not upsetting an arrangement that benefited people who had never once considered that I might be otherwise. I thought about the note in the gray metal box from Gerald. I was told by someone I trusted. Gerald had been fed the same information. Gerald had believed it. Gerald had perhaps even told Nathan, and Nathan had believed it too, and the chain of wrong assumptions had been built on a deliberate foundation that Derek had laid with the particular care of a man who understood how to shape a narrative without leaving fingerprints on it. Nathan was watching me. "Mom, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," I said carefully, "that you were used, not by yourself, by someone who understood your assumptions about me and knew you would carry the message without checking it." He absorbed that. The color in his face changed. "Derek." "Derek," I said. A long silence. "I've been an idiot," Nathan said. It was not self-pity, it was a flat, quiet assessment delivered to the coffee table. "You made choices," I said. "Some of them were motivated by things you'll have to look at honestly for yourself. Some of them were motivated by someone else's agenda. The combination is the problem, not one or the other." He looked up. "Are you going to... Should I be worried about legal exposure? If Derek deliberately... I don't know yet what Derek did or didn't do deliberately," I said. "What I know is that I'm going to speak to Charles about it. Whatever happened, it needs to be understood clearly. Not because I want to punish anyone, but because I want to know the actual shape of what I'm dealing with." Nathan nodded. He was still a mess. I could see it in the way he was holding himself, like someone who had been running on adrenaline and was now feeling the absence of it. He was 44 years old, and he was sitting in his mother's living room, having discovered, in the space of a week, that the story he had built his assumptions on was built on sand, and that some of the sand had been put there deliberately. I was not satisfied with his apology. I want to be accurate about that. It was a beginning, not an end, and I was going to hold the space between beginning and end instead of collapsing it the way I always had. But I also looked at him, and I felt what I had always felt, underneath everything. The particular ache of loving someone who has hurt you, the complexity of it, the way it refuses to resolve into anything simple. "I need to talk to a lot of people," I said. "I need to talk to Charles and to the financial team, and I need to spend some time, real time, figuring out what I want to do with what I've been given. That is going to be the next weeks and months. I need to do that work, Nathan, and I need to do it without managing your feelings about it at the same time." "I know," he said. I'm not going to make this about me, or I'm going to try not to." "That's all I'm asking," I said. "Try." He stood to go. He paused at the door in the same way Carolyn had paused at the conference room door. That particular hesitation of someone who has more to say but doesn't yet know how to say it. "She was right about you," he said. "Margaret. In the letter. She was right." I didn't answer that. Some things don't need an answer. Some things just need to be heard. After he left, I stood at the window again, the same window where I had watched him walk to his car a week ago with the expression of a man who had already decided what I was worth. The street looked the same. The hydrant was where it always was. November light, the thin kind. But I was not the same person standing at it. I called Charles that afternoon and told him about Gerald's note and about Derek Paulson. Charles listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret mentioned Paulson in a memo she wrote during the final revision process. I thought it was background context. I may need to reconsider that." "What did she say?" "She said, I heard him reaching for something, the sound of a folder. I am aware that Derek Paulson continues to represent himself as having knowledge of my estate arrangements. He does not. I want the record to reflect that any information he has claimed to possess or to have shared is categorically unauthorized and should be treated as misrepresentation." End quote. A pause. She filed it with the estate documents. I didn't understand at the time why she was being that specific. She knew, I said. She knew he would do this. It appears so. I thought about Margaret writing that memo, about her knowing, in the last months of her life, that Derek Paulson was circling the edges of her estate, shaping perceptions, doing what he had always done, using information as currency and other people's assumptions as the exchange rate. She had known, and she had not been able to stop it from happening. What she had been able to do was document it, preemptively, so that when it came to light, there was already a record of her position. She had anticipated the interference she had spent her whole life trying to prevent, and she had protected against it in the only way available to her. I sat in my kitchen with the phone in my hand after I hung up with Charles, and I looked at the gray metal box on the table, and I thought about all the things that box represented. Not just the documents, not just the money, but the years. The discipline of keeping something real and true and private for 18 years without letting the world's pressure to define me collapse it. The choice, made quietly and repeatedly, to hold on to the truth of what I had done and what I was owed without making it a public fight. I had been told, in various ways over 18 years, that my silence was the same as acceptance, that staying small meant I had agreed to be small, that the woman who walked away had given up her claim to everything she had been part of building. Derek had built a whole strategy on that interpretation. Nathan had lived inside it, and none of them, not one of them, had understood that there is a profound difference between a woman who has nothing and a woman who is waiting. Margaret had understood it. She had understood it well enough to spend 8 months building something airtight around it, to leave a memo on file about Derek Paulson, to write a letter on Cream stationery telling me to take up the space my work had earned. I picked up the gray metal box. I held it in my lap the same way I'd held it on the edge of my bed a week ago, before any of this had happened in the open air. Then I set it down and I started making a list. Not of things I was owed, not of grievances. A different kind of list. The kind you make when you have been given back the room to think about what you actually want, after years of only thinking about what would cause the least disruption. What did I want the next years of my life to look like? The answer surprised me by coming clearly and immediately, without the usual hesitation. Not revenge, not recognition, not the public acknowledgement of everything I had been denied. I was too old for that kind of satisfaction, and I had watched enough people spend their best years chasing it to know it didn't deliver what it promised. What I wanted was to use what I had, to do something real with it, to build something that was entirely and undeniably mine, in my own name, from a place of choice rather than survival. I thought about the 43 employees who had been at Whitmore Partners in 2006 when I walked away, people whose livelihoods had been part of the reason I made the choice I made. I thought about what it meant to protect something at cost to yourself and to have that protection go unacknowledged. I thought about every person I had ever known who had done quiet, essential work and had it attributed to someone with a louder name. The list grew. Outside, November had gone full dark by 5 o'clock, the way it does, and I turned on lights one by one as the room required them, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that was the right temperature this time, and I wrote until my hand was tired. Tomorrow there would be more phone calls, more documents. Nathan would be processing what he'd learned, and the situation with Derek Paulson would require careful navigation, and Charles would begin the transfer process that would make $14 million real in my life in ways I was not yet fully able to imagine. But tonight, I had a list, and a cup of tea, and a kitchen full of ordinary light. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like myself. The list I made that Thursday night ran to 2 pages. I am not going to pretend it was a perfectly organized document, because it wasn't. It was written in the slightly erratic handwriting of someone thinking faster than their hand wanted to move, with words crossed out and rewritten and marginal notes that only made sense to me, and a few places where I had stopped mid-thought and just written a single word in larger letters and underlined it, the way you do when you don't have language for something yet, but you know the feeling that needs language. One of those words was foundation. Another was Nathan. And the third, written at the bottom of the second page and underlined twice, was Derek. I slept better that night than I had in 2 weeks. Not well, I woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark for an hour thinking about things I could not resolve at 3 in the morning, which is a waste of time I have never been able to stop doing entirely, but better. There is something about knowing the shape of what you're dealing with, even when the shape is complicated and not fully resolved, that allows the body to rest in a way that uncertainty doesn't permit. The following Monday, I met with the team from Mercer & Associates. There were two of them, a woman named Patricia Chen, who was the lead financial advisor on the estate transfer, and a younger man named Aiden who handled the documentation side and who took notes throughout the meeting in a way that suggested he was very good at his job and aware that part of that job was being invisible while doing it. Patricia was direct, clear, and had the particular quality of professional warmth that comes from years of working with people at some of the most disorienting moments of their lives. She was not cold, but she also did not pretend that the numbers were anything other than what they were. We met at her firm's office, a modest suite in a building on the west side of downtown. I had expected something more formal, something that signaled the weight of the sum being transferred, but the office was comfortable and practical, and Patricia had a half-eaten granola bar on her desk that she apologized for without moving, which I found reassuring. "So," she said, once we'd gotten through the preliminary documentation, "I want to start by asking you a question I ask all my clients in this situation, which is, what do you know about managing significant assets?" I thought about it honestly. I know the conceptual framework. I worked in and around financial decisions for 20 years through Whitmore Partners, though my focus was never on the investment side specifically. I understand compounding, diversification, risk structures. What I don't have is current direct experience making decisions at this scale. Patricia nodded. She seemed to appreciate the accuracy. That's a better starting point than most people give me. A lot of people coming into situations like this either overestimate what they know or panic and want someone else to make all the decisions. You're in neither category, which means we can actually talk. "Good," I said, "because I have some specific things I want to do with a portion of this, and I want to understand whether those things are viable before I commit to them." "Tell me." I told her about the list. Not the personal items, not Nathan, not Derek. Those were separate conversations. But the core of what I had been thinking about since Thursday evening, the idea of using a meaningful portion of the inheritance to establish something real, something structured, not a passive donation to an existing organization, but something I would build and have authority over, something that reflected the specific knowledge I had accumulated over decades of doing work that had never been formally credited. I had spent 20 years helping other people's ideas survive contact with the real world. I wanted to build something that did the same thing for people who lacked not the vision or the ability, but the access, the connections, the resources, the introductions that changed what was possible. "What population specifically?" Patricia asked. "Women over 50, I said. "Starting over, coming out of situations, divorce, job loss, caregiving, whatever has put them in a position of starting from very little when they have, in fact, a great deal to offer. They need not charity, but infrastructure, workspace, mentorship, access to the right conversations." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a real gap." "I know it is," I said. "I lived in it for 18 years. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, I had a preliminary picture of what was possible, a structure that would allow me to establish a foundation with adequate capitalization while maintaining enough in managed investments to ensure my own long-term security, and with appropriate reserves for contingencies I couldn't predict. Patricia was direct about the fact that I would need legal counsel in addition to financial advice, and that the foundation side would require its own set of decisions about governance and mission scope that were beyond her specific expertise. "But the short version," she said, "is that what you're describing is financially viable with substantial room to execute well." I drove home thinking about the word viable. I had spent so long in the territory of making do, of working around constraints, of accepting what was available rather than planning for what I actually wanted. That viable felt almost extravagant. I was still thinking about it when Charles called. "I've done some additional research on the Derek Paulson situation," he said, without preamble, which was how Charles operated when he had something that mattered. And I want to share what I found before you decide how you want to proceed. Go ahead. Derek has been active in the development community here in the last 3 years. He's operating under a consulting firm he established, Paulson Advisory Group, which has been working with several smaller investors on projects adjacent to Whitmore Partners territory. One of his clients, as Nathan mentioned, is Gerald. I know this part, I said. What don't I know? What you don't know, Charles said, is that Derek applied for a formal advisory role with the Whitmore Partners Estate Trust. He submitted the application to this firm 6 months before Margaret passed away. I pulled my car to a stop at a red light and stayed there for a moment after it turned green, which earned me a horn from the car behind me. He applied to the trust, I said. Yes, he framed it as offering continuity expertise. He had worked with some of the company's investor base during the marriage years and was positioning that as relevant experience. The application was reviewed and declined. Margaret was informed because we flag anything involving parties with prior relationships to the estate, and Charles paused, and I could hear him pulling up something. She responded with one sentence. She wrote, "Under no circumstances." And that was the end of it. I thought about Derek Paulson submitting a formal application to insert himself into Margaret's estate management. I thought about him being declined clearly and finally, and then, rather than accepting that, pivoting to a different strategy. One that didn't require the estate's formal approval. One that worked through Nathan's assumptions and Gerald's ambitions and the quiet, unexamined belief that I was nobody who had nothing left. It was so entirely consistent with who he was that it was almost elegant in its awfulness. He was trying to get access, I said. When the front door closed, he went around to the side. That's my assessment, Charles said. And the memo Margaret filed makes considerably more sense in this context. She knew he'd been declined. She knew he would find another angle. She prepared for it. Can anything be done? Formally? Charles considered. The estate could potentially pursue a claim based on misrepresentation if it could be demonstrated that his statements to Nathan or Gerald were deliberately intended to interfere with the estate's execution. It would require establishing intent, which is difficult. Realistically, the cost and energy of pursuing it formally probably outweighs the concrete outcome. I know, I said. I'm not asking because I want to pursue it formally. Then what are you asking? I thought about it. What I was asking, I realized, was whether I needed to be afraid of Derek Paulson. Whether the shape of what he had done was the beginning of something ongoing or the end of something that had already failed. I'm asking whether he's still a problem, I said. My honest assessment, Charles said carefully, is that Derek's leverage depended on the outcome going the way he predicted. He told Gerald and Nathan what he told them because he believed it was true, or believed it was close enough to true that the details wouldn't matter. He was wrong. His credibility with both Nathan and Gerald is now significantly damaged. And more importantly, what he was trying to position himself adjacent to is now structured in a trust with 3 independent trustees, none of whom he has any relationship with. A pause. He doesn't have anywhere to go. I let that settle. Then I said, good. That night I called Nathan and told him what Charles had told me. I did not editorialize. I gave him the facts, the application, the declination, the memo, the strategy as I understood it, and I let him sit with them. Nathan was quiet for a long time after I finished. He told me he had a long-standing relationship with the estate management, Nathan said. His voice was flat. Not angry. Something past anger. The particular flatness of someone who has processed betrayal to the point where what's left is just the clear, cold fact of it. He had a relationship with some of the investors, I said, which he used to create the impression of access he didn't have. And I repeated what he told me. To you. He stopped. I drove to your apartment, and I told you, based on what Derek told me, Nathan, stop. No, Nathan. I waited until he was quiet. Derek Paulson is skilled at what he does. He has been doing this, shaping perceptions, managing what people believe for a long time. Your father and I, your mother and I, both made mistakes because of who he is. You made one too. What matters now is what you do with what you know. A long silence. What do I do with what I know? He asked. And it wasn't rhetorical. He was genuinely asking. I thought about it. You stop taking information about people you love from sources who benefit from your assumptions about them, I said. That's the specific lesson. The broader one is something you'll work out yourself. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, are we okay? And I answered honestly, which I had committed to doing. We're working on it, which is different from okay, but it's also not nothing. He accepted that. I had thought he might push for more, but he didn't. Maybe he had done more growing in the past 2 weeks than I was fully crediting him for. Or maybe he understood that asking for more than I had offered was exactly the kind of move that had gotten him here. Either way, he let it rest. The weeks that followed were busy in a way I had not experienced in a very long time. Busy with purpose rather than with survival, which is an entirely different quality of fullness. I met with attorneys. I met with Patricia again, twice. I had a long conversation with Rosalie, who flew up from Tucson and stayed for 4 days and helped me think through the foundation structure with the particular clarity of a friend who knew me well enough to ask the questions I was avoiding. Who's going to run it? Rosalie asked on the second evening over takeout containers at my kitchen table. If you're building this organization, you need someone who can do the day-to-day. You're the architect, Evelyn. You can't also be the one answering phones. I know, I said. I have some names, people from the nonprofit world, people who've done this kind of program management before. I want to interview a few. And the board? 3 people to start. I have one firm commitment, a woman I worked with during the Whitmore Partners years, a former development director who retired early and has been itching for something to do. She's sharp and she doesn't need the money, which means she'll say what she thinks. Rosalie picked at her noodles. What are you calling it? I hadn't told anyone yet. I had written the name on the list, then crossed it out, then written it again on a separate piece of paper and looked at it for several days. The Hartwell Initiative, I said. My name. Not hers, not ours, mine. Rosalie looked at me across the takeout containers with an expression I recognized as the specific look she got when something mattered. Good, she said. The Hartwell Initiative. I had said it out loud to another person for the first time, and it did not fall apart under the weight of being spoken. It stayed exactly what it was. A name, a real name. The first thing in a very long time that bore only my own. I started sleeping through the night somewhere around the 3rd week of December. I noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you've grown so accustomed to that its presence had become invisible. The specific vigilance that had kept me partially awake for years. The low-grade alertness of someone who is always half waiting for the next thing that will require managing simply wasn't there one morning when I woke at 7 to full light through the curtains and realized I had slept without interruption for 9 hours. I lay there for a moment and just registered it, the quiet of it. Then I got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the list, which was getting worn at the folds from being handled. And I crossed off 3 more items that had been completed and added 2 new ones. It was in that 3rd week of December that Derek Paulson made his final move. I want to be clear about this. I did not see it coming. I had allowed myself, based on Charles's assessment and the clear evidence of Derek's failed strategy, to believe that the situation had resolved itself. That Derek had understood his position and retreated from it with whatever remained of his dignity. I was wrong about that. What I received on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the first Tuesday, the one where Nathan had sat in this same kitchen with his careful expression, was not a letter or a call. It was a visit, unannounced. The doorbell rang at 9:15, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw a man I had not seen in person for 16 years standing in my hallway, looking at my door with an expression I remembered. Derek Paulson was 61 years old. He had aged in the way that some men age, not badly, but in a way that emphasized the sharpness rather than the softness of his face. He was wearing a good coat. He had always worn good coats, had always understood that presentation was the advance team for everything else. I stood at the door for a long moment. Every instinct I had said, Do not open this door. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I understood, in the very clear way of a person who has recently processed exactly who someone is, that Derek's presence here was not accidental or social. He was here because his other approaches had failed and he was recalculating, and being in the room with him while he recalculated was not in my interest. I called Charles. He picked up on the second ring. Derek Paulson is at my door, I said quietly. Unannounced. A brief silence. Don't open it. I know. I'm going to send someone to your address. Is he still there? I looked through the peephole. Derek had stepped back slightly and was looking at his phone. He's waiting. Give me 15 minutes. Don't engage. I waited. Derek knocked twice more over the course of those 15 minutes, and between knocks I could see him through the peephole standing in the hallway with the patient expression of someone who has decided to wait out a particular situation. He had that quality, the ability to make waiting seem like a strategy rather than a defeat. At 12 minutes, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Miss Hartwell? A man's voice, professional. My name is Lawrence Briggs. I'm an attorney with Callaway and Briggs, retained by Charles Whitmore on behalf of the estate. I'm outside your building. Is Mr. Paulson still present? Yes, I said. Understood. I'm going to come up. Please don't open your door until I knock and identify myself. 3 minutes later, there was a knock and the words, Lawrence Briggs, Callaway and Briggs, spoken through the door, and I opened it to a man in his 50s with a briefcase and a calm that was entirely professional. He glanced down the hallway. Mr. Paulson. Derek looked up from his phone, and in the moment he registered Lawrence Briggs standing outside my open door with a briefcase, something in his expression shifted. The patience evaporating, replaced by a recalculation I could see happening in real time. I just wanted a conversation, Derek said. His voice was easy, reasonable. He was very good at reasonable. Evelyn and I go back a long way. I thought, Ms. Hartwell isn't available for unscheduled visits, Lawrence said. His voice was not unkind. It was simply completely unmovable. Any communication you wish to direct to Ms. Hartwell or to the estate of Margaret Whitmore should be directed to our firm in writing. I can give you our contact information. Derek looked at me past Lawrence's shoulder. I looked back at him. I did not say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. Something happened in his face in those 3 or 4 seconds of eye contact, something that passed too quickly to be fully named, but that I had seen before, in other versions, on other faces, at other moments when a person recognizes that the angle they were working has genuinely and completely closed. It was not quite defeat. It was the specific expression of a man who is very good at finding doors, and has just understood that this particular hallway has no more of them. All right, he said. He put his phone in his pocket. All right. He walked to the elevator without another word. When the doors closed, Lawrence exhaled once, controlled, quiet, and turned to me. Are you all right? He said. Yes, I said. Thank you. Charles will want to speak with you this afternoon. We may want to consider a formal no-contact instruction, depending on how you want to proceed. I'll talk to Charles, I said. Come in for a minute. I'll make coffee. Lawrence looked slightly surprised, then slightly not surprised, in a way that made me think he was a person who appreciated small dignities more than he usually let on. Thank you, he said. That would be welcome. I made the coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table. The table that had hosted so many important conversations in the last 3 weeks that I was beginning to think of it differently, not as the place where I ate soup alone, but as something more like a center of gravity. And Lawrence Briggs told me what Charles had put together about Derek's recent activities. It was more extensive than I had realized. Derek had been making representations to at least 4 different parties in the past year about the likely outcome of Margaret's estate. Not just Nathan and Gerald, 2 other investors in the regional development community, people who had worked with Whitmore Partners at various points, people whose financial planning had been influenced in some degree by what Derek had told them to expect. The full scope of the damage was not yet clear, but Charles had begun the process of documenting it with the intention of formally notifying the affected parties that the representations had been unauthorized and inaccurate. Is there exposure for the estate? I asked. No, Lawrence said. The estate's documentation is clean and the addendum makes the authorization picture unambiguous. The exposure, such as it is primarily Derek's, and potentially Gerald's, depending on how fully he was aware of what Derek was doing versus how fully he was simply misled. Gerald sent me a note, I said, early on, warning me to be careful. I think he may have understood, at some point, that what he'd been told wasn't fully reliable. Lawrence nodded. That's consistent with what Charles has found. Gerald's attorney has been in contact. Gerald is not cooperating exactly, but not obstructing either. He's in an uncomfortable position. He benefited from the assumption Derek was promoting, and he didn't do enough due diligence on where Derek's information was coming from. He wanted it to be true, I said. So he didn't look too hard at whether it was. Lawrence looked at me with a slight expression that was the professional version of exactly. After he left, I sat at the table for a while. I thought about Derek standing in my hallway with his good coat and his reasonable voice, and about the fact that his entire strategy, the application to the trust, the conversations with Gerald, the information he fed Nathan, the visit this morning, had been built on one foundational assumption, that I was someone who could be managed around, that the space I occupied was small enough that he could work in it without encountering real resistance. He had done what people do when they underestimate someone who is quiet. He had mistaken the quiet for emptiness. There's a thing that happens, I was learning, when you spend 18 years in a small space and then the space suddenly opens. The people who benefited from the small space do not simply accept the change. They test the new boundaries. They look for the edges of the expansion, probe for weakness, wait for the moment when the person who has been quiet will default back to quiet, because that's what they know how to do. Derek had come to my door this morning because he needed to know if I would open it. I had not opened it. That was the whole conversation, really. I called Nathan that evening. Not about Derek. I would tell him about the visit in time, but not tonight. Tonight I called for a different reason. I want to have dinner with the boys, I said. With your sons. Before the holidays, I haven't made enough effort there, and that's partly the situation and partly something I need to own. I'd like to change it. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then, yeah, we can do that. Just dinner, nothing formal, at my place if they're willing, or somewhere they'd actually want to be. They'd come to your place, he said. And then, after a pause, they've been asking about you. Since everything, Marcus asked me what the will reading was. I told him it was complicated. What did he say? Nathan made a sound that was almost a laugh. He said, "Is Grandma okay? He's 14. He was worried about you." I held the phone and let that settle. Marcus was 14, and he had been worried about me. My 14-year-old grandson, who I had seen at 6 holidays in the last 3 years, and who I had allowed myself to become peripheral to because it was easier than navigating Nathan's version of our family. He had heard about a will reading, and his first thought had been whether his grandmother was all right. "Tell him I'm okay," I said. "Tell him I'm better than okay." "I will," Nathan said. We set a date for the following Saturday. I told him I'd make the potato leek soup, the slow one that took an afternoon. He said the boys didn't really eat soup. I said the boys could eat it anyway. It was good for them. He laughed. An actual laugh, not managed, not performed. The kind I remembered from when he was young and the world hadn't yet taught him to be careful with his responses. It was the best thing I had heard in 3 weeks. I spent that Friday moving. Not moving apartments, that was coming. That decision had been made but not yet executed, and the practicalities of it were being organized by people who were very good at practicalities. This was a different kind of moving. I went through the apartment room by room, and I was honest with myself about what I was keeping and what I was releasing. Some of this was literal. 18 years of careful smallness accumulates in ways you don't notice. Things kept because they were practical. Furniture bought for function rather than preference. A kitchen organized for one person eating alone on most evenings. I filled 3 bags for donation and 1 for the trash, and I stood in the middle of the living room afterward, and the room felt different. Not empty, just more deliberate. The gray metal box I kept. Not for the documents. Those had been superseded and were now housed properly in Charles's files and in the estate record. I kept the box because of what it meant to have had it, because the discipline of locking something true away and not letting the world's pressure to define you collapse. It is a thing that deserves to be remembered, not a thing to be set aside once it is no longer strictly necessary. Some things you keep not because you need them anymore, but because forgetting what they cost you is its own kind of loss. I set the box on the shelf above my desk, between two books I had read many times. I stood back and looked at it there. Small gray metal box between two worn paperbacks. It looked ordinary. It looked like nothing if you didn't know. That was exactly right. On Saturday, Nathan arrived with Carolyn and both boys at 6:15, which was 15 minutes late, which was so entirely Nathan that I had set the soup for 6:30. Marcus was taller than I remembered. They always are. Children, they grow in the gaps between the times you see them. And he had Margaret's eyes, that particular focused quality that appeared when he walked into the room and assessed it quickly without appearing to. His younger brother Eli was 12 and louder, easier in his skin in the specific way of children who are loved without complication, and he went directly to the bookshelf in the living room and started reading the spines with the absorbed interest of someone who was going to live in books. Marcus stood in the kitchen doorway while I stirred the soup. "Grandma," he said. "Marcus?" "Dad says you're doing okay." "I am." He leaned against the door frame. He had that teenager quality of pretending to be casual while actually paying close attention. He also said, "You're going to start a business or something, like an organization." "Something like that," I said. "A foundation, for people who need a different kind of help than what's usually available." He considered this. "What kind of people?" "Women, mostly, who are starting over, who have more to offer than anyone is giving them credit for." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like you." I looked at him over the soup pot. 14 years old, in Margaret's eyes, and the particular quality of saying true things simply without knowing they were going to land the way they did. "Yes," I said, "it does." Dinner was not smooth. I want to be honest about that. Nathan and I were not at the point where everything was easy between us, and there were moments at the table where the weight of the last month was present in the specific way that weights are present at family dinners, not spoken, but felt, shaping the pacing of conversations, the topics that were approached and then redirected. Carolyn was careful and kind in the way she had been on the phone that first night, and I appreciated the carefulness even when it made the air slightly formal. But Eli ate 2 bowls of soup and said it was the best thing he'd had in a month, which Nathan visibly tried not to react to. And Marcus helped me clear the table without being asked, and stood at the sink next to me and told me about a history project he was working on, about women who had changed industries without receiving credit for it, and I told him there was more material on that subject than he would ever run out of. And he said he was starting to understand why. After they left, I stood in the kitchen with the last of the dishes and the particular quiet of a home that has recently held people and is now holding their absence. It was a good quiet, the kind that has warmth in it still. I dried the dishes slowly, and I thought about what the next months would look like. The foundation taking shape, the new apartment with its more deliberate rooms, the ongoing work of rebuilding something with Nathan that was more honest than what we'd had before. I thought about Rosalie coming back in February. I thought about the interview I had scheduled with the first candidate for the Hartwell Initiative's executive director role, a woman named Joan Mercer, who had spent 20 years running workforce development programs, and whose resume had made me sit up straight when Patricia had passed it along. I thought about Derek Paulson, who had stood in my hallway and waited for me to open a door I was never going to open. I thought about Margaret writing at her desk on cream stationery with her initials at the top in the last months of her life, building something precise and airtight and addressed, ultimately, to me. Take up the space it earned you. I had been doing that, imperfectly, with wrong turns and incomplete information, and a son I was still learning how to be honest with, and a world that had spent 18 years organizing itself around a version of me that was no longer accurate. But doing it. Outside, December had settled into the kind of cold that is serious about itself, the kind that has no softness in it. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment before switching on the lamp in the hallway, and the apartment shifted from one kind of light to another, and I stood in the transition between them. I was 72 years old, and I had $14 million and a gray metal box on a shelf and a list that was getting longer instead of shorter, and a grandson who had Margaret's eyes and said true things simply. I was not finished. I had, if anything, just started. January arrived the way it always does in this city, without ceremony, without the softness that people who don't live here sometimes imagine winter carries. It was cold and flat, and the sky for the first 2 weeks was the particular shade of gray that is not dramatic enough to be beautiful and not mild enough to be ignored. I moved into the new apartment on the 9th of January, on a Thursday, with the help of 2 men from a moving company who were professional and efficient and who carried the gray metal box with the same care they gave everything else, which I appreciated without explaining. The new apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 12 blocks from where I had lived for 18 years. It had 3 rooms instead of 2, a kitchen with a window that faced east so the morning light came in at an angle that landed on the counter in a way I found, from the first morning, genuinely pleasing. There was a small study, just large enough for a desk and 2 chairs and the bookshelves I had accumulated over decades, and a bedroom that faced a courtyard with a tree in it, bare in January but with the shape of something that would be considerable in spring. I stood in the empty living room on the first evening before the furniture arrived, and I turned slowly in the space, and I thought, this is mine. Not in the defensive way I had thought things were mine during the lean years, clutching at the modest facts of a modest life. In a different way, in the way of someone who has chosen deliberately, who has looked at options and selected this one because it fits who she actually is rather than who circumstance has made her. That distinction matters more than I can tell you. The furniture arrived on Friday. Rosalie had helped me choose most of it during her February visit. She had strong opinions about what constituted a chair worth sitting in, and she was right about every one of them. And the living room that took shape over that first weekend was the first room I had decorated in 18 years that looked like me. Not curated, not performing anything, just the things I actually liked, arranged in a way that made sense for how I actually moved through a space. I hung nothing on the walls that first week. I wanted to live in the rooms before I made decisions about what they needed. That was something I had learned over years of watching other people make choices. The instinct to fill a space immediately, to resolve its blankness as quickly as possible, often results in walls covered with things that were never really chosen, just acquired. I was done with that kind of acquiring. The Hartwell Initiative had its first formal board meeting on the 14th of January. I want to tell you about that meeting because it was one of the most important hours of my life, and also one of the most nerve-wracking, which is a combination I had forgotten was possible for me. I had spent so many years doing things that mattered without the accompanying nerves, or rather, I had spent so many years doing things that mattered for other people under other people's names, that the nerves had never been fully activated, because my own stake in the outcome had always been at one remove from the thing itself. This was different. This was mine, from the name on the letterhead to the mission statement I had written and rewritten over 6 drafts, until it said exactly what I meant and nothing I didn't. This was the thing that bore my history not as a burden, but as a credential. And walking into the conference room at Callaway and Briggs, where Charles had arranged for us to meet, walking in as the founder and not as anyone's representative, required a steadying that I had to do consciously, deliberately, the way you steady yourself before stepping onto ice you're not certain will hold. It held. The board was 3 people to start, as I had planned. Eleanor Voss, the former development director I had mentioned to Rosalie, sat at my right, a woman of 68 who had the specific quality of having survived enough professional nonsense to be entirely immune to it, and who had responded to my initial call with the words, "Finally, something worth doing," before I had finished explaining the premise. To my left was a man named Dr. Raymond Park, a retired economist who had spent 30 years studying wealth distribution and who had agreed to join because, as he put it, he had spent his career documenting a problem and was interested in actually trying to fix part of it. And at the end of the table was Joan Mercer, who had accepted the executive director position after an interview that lasted 2 hours, and in which she asked me harder questions than I asked her, which was exactly the quality I needed. Joan was 53. She had grown up in circumstances that were considerably harder than mine, and had built her expertise in workforce development from the ground level up, starting as a caseworker and ending as the director of one of the city's largest job training programs before the funding collapsed and she found herself, at 51, starting over in a field she had given 20 years to. She had come to the interview carrying that experience not as a wound, but as a map. And when I told her what the initiative was trying to do, she had said, with a directness I found immediately trustworthy, "The gap you're describing is real. I've watched women fall into it my entire career. I've fallen into it myself. The question is whether you're willing to do this in a way that's actually hard, or whether you want something that looks good on a website." I had said, "I want something that works." She had said, "Then we'll get along fine." At the first board meeting, we established the founding mission, the initial program structure, and the first cohort parameters. We were starting with 12 women, a small number, intentionally, because Joan and I had agreed that doing 12 things well was worth more than doing 40 things adequately. Each woman in the first cohort would receive not just financial support, but a full year of structured mentorship, workspace access, professional network introduction, and, critically, the kind of sustained individualized attention that turned a promising restart into a viable one. The selection criteria were specific and deliberately broad at the same time. Women over 50, in a period of significant transition, with demonstrated capability and specific obstacles that the initiative's resources could actually address. We were not looking for the most desperate cases. We were looking for the cases where a targeted intervention could produce a real outcome, because outcomes were what would make the initiative credible, and credibility was what would make it last. "The first cohort is going to be watched," Joan said at that first meeting, "by everyone who thinks this is a nice idea that won't work, and by everyone who wants it to work and is afraid it won't. We need to treat these 12 women accordingly." "We treat them like people," I said, "with specific situations, not like case studies." Joan looked at me. "Yes, exactly that." I thought, sitting at that table, about all the times in my own life when I had been treated like a case study rather than a person. The careful voices, the managed expectations, the way people reduced you to your most visible limitation and then organized their behavior toward you around that reduction rather than around who you actually were. I had survived it. Many people survived it. But survival was not the same as thriving, and the distance between the two was exactly the space the Hartwell Initiative was trying to occupy. We adjourned that first meeting after 90 minutes, having accomplished more than I had expected, and with a clarity of next steps that made the work feel real rather than theoretical. I stood in the hallway outside the conference room afterward, and Eleanor Voss put her hand on my arm briefly and said, "This is going to matter, Evelyn. I want you to know I believe that." I thanked her. I meant it without qualification. The month of January also brought the resolution of the Derek Paulson situation, which concluded not with the confrontation I might have expected, but with the specific quietness of a thing that simply runs out of air. Charles informed me in the third week of January that Derek had reached out to the firm through an attorney of his own, a letter, formal and measured, acknowledging that certain representations he had made regarding the Whitmore estate had been inaccurate and expressing that no further contact with the estate's parties was his intention going forward. It was not an admission of deliberate wrongdoing. It was the careful language of a man who had consulted counsel and been told clearly what exposure he carried if things escalated. Charles sent me a copy of the letter with a brief note. "He understands the position he's in. I don't think you'll hear from him again. I read the letter once. I did not feel what I might have expected to feel. Not triumph, not residual anger, not even the particular satisfaction of watching someone who underestimated you finally understand the size of their mistake. What I felt was something closer to tired, not exhausted, a different kind of tired. The tiredness of having carried something tense and watchful for a long time, and being able, finally, to put it down." I put the copy of Derek's letter in the gray metal box. I thought about what that box now contained: the original partnership documents, the renewal agreements, Margaret's personal letter, Gerald's unsigned warning note, and now the letter of a man who had built a strategy on my invisibility and discovered, too late, that the invisibility had been a choice I made and not a condition I was trapped in. That box was a record, not of my suffering. I was not interested in organizing my life around suffering as a theme. It was a record of what it had taken, of the specific costs of the long game, of keeping faith with a truth that no one else could see, of surviving the years between building something real and being allowed to stand in it openly. I locked the box and set it back on the shelf. Gerald called in February. This surprised me more than Derek's departure had. He called on a Sunday afternoon, and he identified himself with the particular stiffness of someone who is not accustomed to being in the position of making this kind of call. He was 63 years old, and he had spent most of those years in the proximity of Margaret's world without ever being at its center. And I think that particular position, close enough to see the thing, not close enough to hold it, had shaped him in ways he probably could not fully articulate. "I want to say something," he said after we had established that I was willing to speak to him, which I had decided I was. "Go ahead," I said. I should not have trusted Derek's account of the estate without verifying it independently. I made an error in judgment, and it affected how I showed up in that room. And it affected how I treated you, not just recently, but for a long time, because Derek's version of the story about you and Margaret was not the first version I'd heard from him. He's been characterizing things for a while. I accepted those characterizations without doing my own thinking. I sat in my new kitchen in the east-facing light of a February afternoon, and I listened to Margaret's nephew tell me that he had let someone else think for him about who I was. "What changed?" I said. A pause. "Seeing the documents. All of them. When I sat with what was actually written down, the dates, the work, the specificity of what you did for that company, I understood that the story I'd been given was not just incomplete, it was actively wrong, and I don't think that was accidental." "It wasn't," I said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to. I don't have an expectation of anything from this call. I just thought it should be said." I thought about what to say. I thought about the version of me that would have softened this, would have met Gerald's discomfort halfway, would have said something that made the conversation easier for him, because making things easier for other people had been my default setting for most of my adult life. I said, "I appreciate you calling. What you said is true, and acknowledging it matters. I want to be honest with you that I'm not in a position to simply move past everything. Not with you, not with Nathan, not with any of it. What I'm doing is moving forward, which is different. It takes time, and it requires consistency from the people involved. But I'm not closed to it." Gerald said, "That's fair. That's more than fair, actually." "I know," I said. We spoke for a few more minutes about the trust, about the company's ongoing management, about things that were practical and appropriate, and neither of us tried to make more than what they were. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about the strange arithmetic of family, how it is possible for people to cause real harm, and to be, simultaneously, not entirely beyond the possibility of something better. How that does not mean you owe anyone a faster reconciliation than the damage warrants. How the decision about what to do with someone is yours to make on your own timeline, and anyone who tells you otherwise is serving their own comfort and calling it forgiveness. I had learned that the hard way. I was not going to unlearn it. Marcus called me in March, not Nathan, Marcus. Directly, on the phone, on a Tuesday evening, which was apparently something he had decided to do on his own initiative, and which he opened by saying, "Is this weird? Dad doesn't know I'm calling. I just wanted to." "It's not weird," I said. "I'm glad you called." He told me about the history project. It had gone well, he'd gotten the highest grade in the class, and his teacher had asked him to present it to the school's academic showcase in April. He told me this with the specific combination of pride and deflection that 14-year-olds deploy when they are pleased about something and haven't yet learned to own being pleased without armor. "Will you come?" he asked, "to the showcase?" I said yes before he finished the question. There was a pause. Then, "I cited some things you told me in the presentation about women in business, about doing the work without getting the credit. I hope that's okay." I held the phone. I looked out the window at the bare tree in the courtyard, which had, in the 3 months since I'd moved in, developed the first cautious suggestion of buds. Still so small they were barely there, but there. "That's more than okay," I said. "That's the best possible use. He said, in the way of a 14-year-old who has said something that mattered and wants to move on before it gets too heavy, "Cool. Okay. I should probably do my homework." "Go do your homework," I said. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of the new apartment for a long time. The tree in the courtyard was barely visible in the dark, but I knew it was there. In a few weeks it would be full enough to be something real, and I would be able to see it from the bed in the morning when the light came in from the east. I thought about Marcus standing in front of his school, presenting the stories of women who built things and were not credited for them. 14 years old, with Margaret's eyes and a history project that had found its subject in a conversation over soup in his grandmother's kitchen. The chain of things, how one thing leads to another, how the quiet work of a single person can travel through time and land somewhere you did not predict and become something it never could have been if you had not held on to it through the years when holding on felt like its own kind of loss. The Hartwell Initiative launched its first cohort formally on the 1st of March. 12 women, ranging in age from 51 to 67, coming from backgrounds that were as varied as the situations that had brought them to this point. A former architect who had spent 8 years as the primary caregiver for her parents and was trying to re-enter a field that had changed significantly in her absence. A woman who had left a 20-year marriage with almost nothing and a business concept she had been developing in the margins of her life for years. A teacher who had been pushed out of her district in a reduction that was described as budget-driven and that she suspected, with good reason, was age-driven, and 9 others, each with a story that was entirely their own and that shared, at the core, the specific weight of being capable and overlooked. Joan ran the orientation meeting. I sat in the back of the room. I had debated whether to speak at the orientation. Joan and I had discussed it. She had said, "You can speak if you want to, but you don't have to. Your presence is already a statement." And I had thought about that, about the difference between being visible and being performative, about how often people in positions of power feel the need to speak in rooms where their listening would be more valuable. I listened. I watched 12 women sit in a circle of chairs in the workspace we had leased on the 3rd floor of a building on the south side of the city, bright windows, long tables, a kitchen that was functional rather than decorative, and I watched them look at each other with the specific combination of wariness and recognition that happens when people who have been told they are alone in a situation discover that the room is full of people in the same one. The woman to Joan's left, the architect, whose name was Diane, said something early in the orientation that I have not stopped thinking about since. Joan had asked each woman to say, in a sentence or two, what they most needed from the year ahead. Not what they wanted, what they needed. Diane said, "I need someone to take me seriously before I have proven that I deserve it, because I have been in rooms for 20 years where I had to earn the right to speak, and by the time I'd earned it, the conversation had moved on." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the woman across from her, the one with the business concept and the long marriage, said, "Yes, that exactly." And from the back of the room, I thought, this is what the money is for. Not the building, not the chairs, not even the mentorship or the network or the year of sustained attention. The money is for making a room where women who have spent decades earning the right to speak can walk in and be heard before they've proven anything, because they have already done the proving. They did it in the years when no one was keeping the record. We were keeping the record now. I drove home from that orientation with the windows down, even in March, even in the cold, because I needed the air and the noise and the feeling of the city moving around me. I drove through streets I had lived near for years without seeing clearly, streets that looked different now, not because they had changed, but because I was different, because the woman driving through them was not the same woman who had moved through them in the contraction of 18 years, and seeing the city through different eyes is genuinely like seeing it for the first time in certain ways, and like finally seeing it accurately in others. I got home, and I sat at the desk in the small study, and I wrote. Not for the initiative, not for any specific purpose. Just writing, the kind that is for yourself, that is not going to become anything, that serves only the function of putting things in order inside a mind that has had a great deal to process in a very short period of time. I wrote about the gray metal box and the Tuesday morning with Nathan and the conference room, and Charles reading Margaret's personal statement in a voice that gave nothing away. I wrote about Derek standing in my hallway, and about Gerald calling on a Sunday, and about Marcus asking me to come to his school showcase. I wrote about Diane in the circle of chairs saying she needed to be taken seriously before she had proven she deserved it. I wrote for 2 hours, and when I stopped, my hand was stiff, and the study was dark except for the lamp on the desk, and outside the window the city had settled into its nighttime sounds. I looked at what I had written. It was not clean, it was not organized, but it was true, and true in a specific way. The way of something that has been observed from the inmate, that carries the texture of actual experience rather than the smooth surface of retrospect. I thought, for the first time, that there might be something in this. Not a memoir. I was not interested in writing a memoir. The genre required a kind of retrospective certainty that I had never trusted. But something. Some form that could carry what I had learned and make it useful to someone else who needed it. I set it aside. It was not urgent, but I noted it. The showcase was in April, on a Friday evening in the gymnasium of Marcus's school, which had been dressed up with displays and project boards in a way that was earnest and slightly chaotic and entirely appropriate. I arrived with Nathan and Carolyn and Eli, which was the first time I had attended anything as part of that family unit in several years, and the strangeness of it was present, but not overwhelming. We were not a restored version of what we had been. We were something different, something that was being built in real time, with the care that things require when they have been damaged, and the people building them are honest about what the damage was. Nathan and I were not easy yet. I want to be accurate about that. There were moments in that gymnasium where we stood next to each other and the weight of the previous months was between us in a way that required both of us to choose, actively, to be present rather than defended. He was making the choice. I could see him making it. That counted for something. Maybe more than anything else. The visible effort of a person trying, imperfectly, to be better than their worst behavior. I had decided, somewhere in the months since January, that watching someone try was worth more than requiring them to have already arrived. Marcus's presentation was the third one we saw. He stood in front of a trifold board that was covered in photographs, timelines, and handwritten analysis, and he spoke for 7 minutes about women who had contributed foundational work to industries that had credited other people for it. He was composed. He was clear. He made eye contact with his audience in the way that people who have thought carefully about what they're saying tend to make eye contact, not performing, just present. Near the end, he said, "What I learned from this project is that being uncredited doesn't mean you didn't build something. It means the record got it wrong, and the record can be corrected." He looked at me when he said it. Not obviously, not in a way that announced itself. Just briefly, directly, a 14-year-old boy who had done his homework. I held myself together. Eli tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Is Marcus talking about you?" I looked down at my 12-year-old grandson with his easy, uncomplicated presence. "A little bit," I said. "Yes." Eli nodded. "Cool," he said, and went back to eating a cookie he'd gotten from a table near the door. After the showcase, standing in the parking lot in April air that was finally warm enough to mean something, Nathan said to me, "He did good." "He did," I said. "He worked hard on it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He was watching Marcus across the lot, talking to his teacher with the animation of someone receiving praise he had earned. "I've been hard on you," Nathan said, "for a long time, in ways that I told myself they were realistic. That I was seeing you clearly, but I was seeing what I expected to see." "I know," I said. "I don't know how to fix that. All of it. I'm trying to figure out what fixing it even looks like." I looked at my son, 44 years old, in a parking lot, watching his child receive credit for work he had done, trying to understand the distance between what he had believed about me and what was true. "You don't fix it all at once," I said. "You make different choices than the ones that caused it. You make them consistently, over time, and the relationship becomes something different because the choices are different. That's all fixing it ever is." He looked at me. "That sounds like something Margaret would have said." "She would have," I said. "She was right about a lot of things. She was also wrong about a lot of things. We were both. That's how it works." He nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. I'm glad you didn't open the door, he said. When Derek came. I'm glad you called Charles instead of... I'm glad you didn't let him in. I knew better, I said. Yeah. He looked at the ground briefly, then back up. I should have too. It was the most honest thing Nathan had said to me about Derek, about his own role in what had happened, about the series of choices he had made that had led to a Tuesday morning in my kitchen. It was not a complete accounting. It was not enough on its own. But it was set in a parking lot under April's sky, without performance or management. And it was true. And I took it for what it was. We drove home separately. I drove alone, which I preferred, with the radio on low and the window cracked and the city transitioning from its Friday evening rush into the softer traffic of a night that had warmth in it. I thought about Margaret. I do this still. Think about her at unexpected moments, while I'm driving or making tea or standing in the study looking at the gray metal box on the shelf. I think about who she was and who we were together, and all the complicated, imperfect truth of 20 years shared between two people who loved each other, and also, at various points, failed each other in ways that mattered. I think about the memo she wrote about Derek Paulson. I think about her sitting at a desk in the last months of her life, building something airtight and addressed to me, with the precise attention to structure that was one of the things I had always loved and sometimes resented about her. I think about the line she wrote. I should have said it more directly when I had the opportunity. And I think about how often we all defer the direct thing, the true thing, the thing that would actually reach the person we're speaking to. We defer it because it's uncomfortable, because the timing isn't right, because we tell ourselves there will be another moment, and there are so many other moments ahead that surely one of them will be better than this one. And then the moments run out. I am 72 years old. My moments are not unlimited. I know this in the abstract way that everyone knows it, and I know it in the more specific way of a woman who has watched people she loved run out of them. I have stopped deferring the direct thing. By midsummer, the Hartwell Initiative's first cohort was 6 months in, and the results were not perfect. I want to be clear about that because I said we would not pretend, and I meant it. 2 of the 12 women had encountered obstacles that the program had not been structured to fully address, and Joan and I had spent several weeks in conversation about what that revealed and how the second cohort's design needed to change as a result. One woman had withdrawn from the program in the 3rd month due to personal circumstances that had nothing to do with us, and her withdrawal had reminded me, usefully, that support structures exist within lives that are larger than the structures themselves, and that the most important thing we could do in those situations was make sure the door remained open. But the other 9. The 9 who were midway through the year and building things. The architect who had begun a consulting practice focused on adaptive design for aging populations. The woman with the long marriage and the business concept who had signed her first client. The teacher who had pivoted into curriculum development and was, for the first time in years, being sought after rather than sidelined. Those 9 were evidence of something real. Not perfect. Real. There's a difference. I had learned that the difference was everything. In August, I gave my first public talk. Joan had been approached by a regional conference on workforce development, the kind of conference that convenes people who care about these issues and need both data and narrative to take back to their institutions, and she had suggested me as a keynote speaker. I had resisted for about 3 days and then recognized that the resistance was not about whether I could do it, but about whether I was willing to be fully visible in the way that a keynote speaker is visible. Whether I was willing to stand in a room and be the person the story was about, rather than the person managing the story for someone else. I was willing. I spoke for 35 minutes to an audience of about 300 people who worked in workforce development, philanthropy, policy, and adjacent fields. I told them about the Hartwell Initiative and what we had learned in our first 6 months. I told them about the specific gap we were trying to address and why the design of the program had been built around consistent, individualized attention rather than scale. I told them about Diane saying she needed to be taken seriously before she had proven she deserved it. And then, because the room deserved the full thing rather than the professional summary, I told them about myself, about the 20 years of work that had lived in other people's names, about the gray metal box and what was in it, about the choice I had made in 2006 that had cost me publicly and protected something that mattered, and the 18 years of ordinary Tuesday mornings that followed. About a will reading in November in a conference room and a lawyer reading a personal letter in a steady voice. I did not tell it as a story about triumph. I told it as a story about the long game, about what it actually costs to hold on to the truth of what you've built when no one is keeping the public record of it, and about what happens when the record finally catches up. The room was very quiet when I finished. Then a woman in the third row started clapping, and the applause that followed was the kind that comes from people who are clapping not out of politeness, but because something they recognized has been spoken out loud in a room where it was allowed to be real. I stood at the podium, and I took it in, and I did not deflect it. A woman approached me afterward, 60s, precise, the particular posture of someone who has run things, and introduced herself as the director of a national foundation focused on economic equity. She said, "I want to talk about what you're building. I think we might be trying to solve adjacent problems." That conversation lasted 40 minutes and resulted in a meeting scheduled for October, and eventually, in a partnership that would allow the Hartwell Initiative to expand its second cohort to 24 women and to add a component focused on policy advocacy that I had wanted from the beginning but hadn't had the infrastructure to execute. I did not tell anyone about that conversation immediately. I drove home from the conference, and I sat in the study in the late afternoon light, and I wrote in the journal I had been keeping since March, the one that had started as unorganized processing and had become something more deliberate over time. And I wrote about the woman in the third row who clapped first, and about what it felt like to say a true thing in a large room and have it received. October brought the meeting with the National Foundation, and in the same week, something I had not anticipated. A letter from Derek Paulson's attorney addressed to Charles, requesting a meeting to discuss a potential resolution to the misrepresentation matter that the estate had documented. The language was careful, and the request was framed as wanting to address outstanding concerns in a constructive manner, which was the legal equivalent of acknowledging that you had been wrong without quite saying the word wrong. Charles called me. "We don't have to engage," he said. "The matter is documented. The estate is protected. If you want, we simply decline." I thought about it. "What does engaging get us?" I asked. "Potentially a formal acknowledgement and a specific commitment from him about ongoing conduct. It doesn't undo what happened, but it puts something on the record." "Schedule the meeting," I said. Charles was quiet for a moment. "You want to be there?" "Yes," I said. The meeting happened on a Wednesday morning in Charles's conference room, the same room where the will had been read almost a year earlier. Derek arrived with his attorney, a composed man named Franklin who had the specific quality of being paid to be reasonable. Charles was there, and Lawrence Briggs, and me. Derek looked older than he had in my hallway in December. He looked like a man who had spent the intervening year in the specific discomfort of having overplayed a hand he had miscalculated entirely. He was still well-dressed. He still had the posture of a man who moved through rooms expecting to shape them. But something in the expectation had been recalibrated, and the recalibration showed in the way he sat, slightly less forward than he would have sat before, slightly more aware of the room around him. He looked at me once, directly, when he came in. I met his eyes and did not look away, and the look held for a moment, and then he looked at the table. The meeting was formal and brief. His attorney read a prepared statement acknowledging that Derek had made representations about the Whitmore estate that were inaccurate and unauthorized, that these representations had been made to parties including Nathan Hartwell and Gerald Whitmore, and that Derek accepted responsibility for the impact of those representations. The statement confirmed his commitment to no further contact or representation regarding the estate or its beneficiaries. It was careful language. It was not everything. It did not include the word deliberately or the word intent, or anything that would fully acknowledge what I believed had been a calculated strategy rather than an error in judgment. I knew that was the limit of what was achievable in a room like this with attorneys on both sides. But it was something. It was the record. And the record, as Marcus had said in April, could be corrected. Charles accepted the statement on behalf of the estate. Lawrence signed the acknowledgement document. Derek's attorney gathered his papers. Before they stood to leave, I said, "I'd like to say something." Everyone looked at me. I'm not going to talk about what you did or why, I said to Derek directly. You know what you did and you know why, and anything I say about it doesn't add to what's already been said. What I want to say is this. You built what you built on the assumption that I was someone who could be managed around. That assumption was wrong, and I want you to be clear on why it was wrong. Not because I had powerful attorneys or a fortunate inheritance or anything external. It was wrong because I spent 18 years knowing what was true and holding on to it without requiring anyone to confirm it for me. That's not a quality that disappears when someone decides it's inconvenient. It's a quality that compounds. Derek looked at me. I'm saying this not for my sake, I said. I'm past needing this conversation to be satisfying. I'm saying it because there will be other people in your life whose quiet you mistake for emptiness, and I want you to have heard at least once what that mistake costs. Franklin, Derek's attorney, looked like he was considering whether to intervene. Derek said nothing, but he heard it. I could see that he heard it. They left. Charles exhaled once. Lawrence gathered his files. How do you feel? Charles asked me. Done, I said. I feel done. And I was. The first anniversary of Margaret's death was in November, and I spent it quietly, not in ceremony, not in performance, but in the way of someone who marks things privately because some things belong in that register. I made the potato leek soup again. I sat at the kitchen table with the gray metal box, and I took out Margaret's letter one more time, and I read it through, and then I put it back. I thought about what she had said. I love you, Ev, in the way that does not expire and does not require anything from you to remain true. I believe that, not because it is a comfortable thing to believe, but because I know who Margaret was, and I know that the most precise thing she ever said about herself was that she was better at building structures around truth than at saying the truth directly while she had the chance. The structure she built around this particular truth was a $28 million estate document and an addendum and a personal letter and a memo about Derek Paulson, all assembled with the same meticulous care she had brought to every important thing in her life. It was the most Margaret possible way to say what she needed to say. I loved her. Imperfectly, in the way of two people who built something real together and also caused each other real harm, and who spent years on either side of a distance that was partly chosen and partly imposed and never fully closed while she was alive. I loved her in a way that did not require the distance to have been the right choice, or the marriage to have ended the way it should have, or any of the imperfect things to be anything other than what they were. The love was real. The rest was complicated. Both things were true simultaneously. Now I want to talk to you directly, because I have been talking to you for this entire story, and I would like, at the end of it, to say what it means, not what it meant to me. That has been the whole of what I have just told you, but what I think it means in the broader sense for anyone who is listening. Here is what I know. Being quiet is not the same as having nothing to say. It has never been the same, though the world will treat you as though it is, and will continue to treat you that way with impressive consistency until the moment it can't anymore. I spent 18 years being quiet in ways that were sometimes chosen and sometimes just the accumulated habit of choosing the smallest available disruption, and the world organized itself around my silence with the comfortable efficiency of systems that benefit from certain people staying small. What I want you to understand is that the silence was a strategy, not a surrender, and that there is an enormous difference between a person who is quiet because they have accepted their diminishment and a person who is quiet because they are holding something that will matter when the moment arrives. Know which one you are. Hold on to it. The second thing I know is about family, and I'm going to say it plainly because I have been polite about it for too long. There are people who love you and who will still, when it serves them, reduce you to the version of you that is most convenient for their assumptions. Nathan loved me. I believe that without qualification. He also drove to my apartment and told me I was getting nothing with the expression of a man who had already moved past the moment, and that was a choice that required him to see me as something other than fully real. Both things were true. Love is not a proof against the particular failure of seeing someone clearly. It is not even, sometimes, a protection against using the people you love to confirm what you have already decided to believe. What I did, what I want you to hear, is that I did not let his love become a reason to accept the diminishment. I let the love stay, imperfectly, in the complicated space it occupied. And I drew the line that needed to be drawn, and I held it. And I told him directly that going forward was different from going back. Those are not incompatible things. You are allowed to love people and also require them to be better than their worst choices. You are allowed to keep the door open and still tell the truth about what it costs to have it almost closed. Do not manage other people's discomfort at the expense of your own clarity. That is the specific lesson I carry out of all of this, the one I would give back to the woman sitting in the kitchen that Tuesday morning, if I could reach back through the year to her. Not the $14 million, not the foundation or the conference room or the board meetings or Derek's formal acknowledgement, just this. Stop absorbing other people's discomfort so they don't have to feel what they've done. Let them feel it. It's the only way any of it changes. The third thing is about age, and I am saying this specifically to anyone who is old enough to understand what I mean, and to anyone young enough that they need to hear it before they need it. 72 is not the end of the story. It is not even necessarily the late chapter. What it is a vantage point that is only available from the specific position of having lived through enough to know what endures and what doesn't, what was worth the cost, and what was just the cost, what the real shape of things is after you strip away the noise of urgency and ambition and other people's definitions of what you should be doing with your time. I have more clarity at 72 than I had at 50. I have more patience, more selectivity, more capacity to identify the thing that actually matters in a given situation and give my attention to that rather than to everything else competing for it. These are not compensations for what age takes. They are things that age actually builds. If you let it, if you keep showing up with enough honesty to learn from what happens. The woman who walked into that conference room in November carrying a gray metal box was not a woman arriving at the end of something. She was a woman arriving at the beginning of what the previous decades had been building toward. The beginning required the decades. You cannot have one without the other. I'm telling you this because the world will try, at every stage of a woman's life, but with particular intensity after a certain age, to suggest that what she has to offer has peaked and is declining, that the relevant years are behind her, that the appropriate orientation now is toward managing gracefully what has already been lost. I want you to know that this is the specific and operational lie of a world that benefits from the energy and knowledge and accumulated competence of older women and would prefer to access those resources without being required to treat their owners as fully human. Your age is not your limitation. Your age is part of your credential. Anyone who tells you otherwise is describing their own convenience, not your reality. The Hartwell Initiative is real. The second cohort begins in January with 24 women and an expanded program structure and a partnership that will allow us to do advocacy work I could not have done alone. Joan is building something that will outlast my direct involvement in it, which is exactly what I wanted. Not a monument, but a structure. Not my name on a building, but my name on an idea that belongs, eventually, to the people it serves. Marcus came to see the new apartment in November, on a Saturday, without his parents. He took the bus by himself, which Nathan had apparently approved with only moderate anxiety, and he showed up at my door with a bottle of sparkling cider because, he said, he thought we should celebrate something, but he wasn't sure what specifically. We celebrated, the two of us, at the kitchen table with the sparkling cider and the last of a cake Rosalie had sent from a bakery in Tucson. We talked for 2 hours about his history project and about a new one he was starting, about a book he'd read, about the foundation and what it was trying to do. He asked smart questions. He listened to the answers with Margaret's focused attention, the kind that tells you the person across from you is actually processing what you're saying rather than waiting for their turn. Before he left, he stood in the doorway of the small study and looked at the shelf where the gray metal box sat between the two worn paperbacks. "What's in the box?" he said. I thought about how to answer that. "The record," I said, "of what it took." He looked at it for a moment. "Can I see it sometime?" "When you're older," I said, "and you'll understand more of it." He nodded. "Okay." He picked up his jacket. "Thanks for the cider, Grandma." "Thank you for coming," I said. I watched him walk down the hallway to the elevator. He was taller again. They're always taller. He punched the elevator button and looked back once and gave a small wave, The kind that is trying to be casual and is actually something more than that. And then the elevator came and he was gone. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of the apartment that was mine, entirely, deliberately, completely mine. And I listened to the buildings settle around me the way buildings settle in the evening, the small sounds of structure and temperature doing what they do without anyone directing them. The gray metal box was on the shelf in the study. The tree in the courtyard had lost its leaves again, November doing what November does, but I knew by now the shape of what it would be in spring. I had a second cohort starting in January. I had a partnership that was bigger than I had imagined when I wrote the first version of the list. I had a son who was trying, imperfectly, to see me clearly, and a grandson who took the bus to visit me on Saturdays and asked good questions, and had Margaret's eyes and his own particular way of being in the world that would become something I could not predict, and was glad I would be around long enough to watch. I had my name on something real, not on a marriage or on a company or on a legacy that belonged technically to someone else. On something that started because I decided to build it, that would continue because it worked, and that bore only the name I had been given at birth and had carried through every version of my life, including the version that everyone around me had been so confident for so long would amount to nothing. The woman everyone forgot. That was never the right description. It never had been. What I was, what I had always been, through all of it. Through the quiet years and the costly choices and the Tuesday mornings and the gray metal box on the shelf, was the woman who remembered. Remembered what she had built. Remembered what was true. Remembered what she was owed and what she had chosen to defer and what the difference between those two things actually was. Remembered, even in the years when no one else was keeping the record, that the record existed. That is enough. It has always been enough. It is the only thing, in the end, that ever actually is.